The Scottish Highlands stretched endlessly before us as our rental car wound through the narrow mountain roads. I pressed my face against the cool window, watching the imposing peaks shrouded in gray mist. Our annual family vacation to the remote lodge had become a tradition I'd grown to cherish, though this year felt different somehow. The air seemed heavier, more oppressive than I remembered. Our lodge sat nestled among a cluster of similar wooden structures, all owned by the same hospitality company that operated the Grand Hotel just a 10-minute walk through the pine-scented trails. The building itself was substantial, 2 stories of dark timber with large windows that reflected the surrounding forest like watchful eyes. My parents had been coming here since before I was born, drawn by the isolation and the luxury amenities of the nearby hotel. My family consisted of my parents, my Aunt Beverly, who joined us this year after her recent divorce, my 16-year-old sister Iris with her constant phone addiction, and my 10-year-old sister Lucy, who still believed in monsters under the bed. At 18, I felt responsible for watching over them all, a burden that weighed heavier as we unpacked our belongings in the eerily quiet surroundings. The other lodges appeared mostly empty, their windows dark and lifeless. Only 3 or 4 showed signs of occupation, flickering television screens casting blue shadows against drawn curtains, the occasional silhouette moving past a window. The isolation that usually comforted me now felt ominous, as if we were being watched by unseen eyes from the dense forest that pressed against the backs of all the buildings. That first evening, as I stood on our wooden deck breathing in the crisp mountain air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest seemed to pulse with hidden life, branches creaking and swaying despite the absence of wind. Even the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures were strangely muted, as if nature itself was holding back, waiting for something terrible to unfold. The hotel's indoor pool had always been our daily ritual, a luxurious heated oasis that made the Scottish chill bearable. The facility was impressive, Olympic-sized with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountain vista, surrounded by pristine white tiles that echoed every sound. We'd established our routine over the years: morning swim, afternoon lounging, evening return to the lodge. On our 4th day, everything changed. The moment we entered the pool area, I noticed him. A man in his early 30s with an athletic build and pale skin that suggested he spent more time indoors than his physique implied. He wore expensive-looking goggles that completely obscured his eyes, making it impossible to tell where he was looking. But I felt his attention on us immediately, a crawling sensation across my skin that made me want to leave. His swimming pattern was bizarre. Instead of doing proper laps, he would dive underwater and remain submerged for unnaturally long periods. When he surfaced, he would be in completely different locations around the pool, always closer to where our family had positioned ourselves. The water distorted his movements beneath the surface, creating ghostly ripples that seemed to follow us wherever we moved. My mother noticed it first. She had a 6th sense about dangerous situations, honed by years of protecting her children. Without saying a word, she caught my eye and gave the subtle signal we'd developed over the years, a slight tilt of her head that meant stay alert and be ready to leave. But her warning came too late. The man was already underwater again, swimming directly beneath us. I watched in growing horror as his distorted form passed under Lucy, then Iris, then myself. He moved with predatory precision, taking his time, studying us from below like a shark circling prey. His presence felt invasive, violating, as if he were mentally photographing us for some unspeakable purpose. The chlorinated water suddenly felt contaminated, poisoned by his intrusion. When he surfaced just meters away from Iris, water streaming from his goggles in a way that made his face appear skeletal, my mother made the decision. We're leaving, now. Her voice carried an urgency that brooked no argument. We climbed out quickly, our wet feet slapping against the cold tiles as we headed for the changing rooms, all of us acutely aware of the man's continued presence in the pool behind us. The men's changing room reeked of industrial disinfectant and damp concrete, a sterile smell that couldn't quite mask something else underneath, something organic and unpleasant. I was alone, my father having finished changing and left already, when I heard the heavy door creak open behind me. My heart hammered against my ribs as footsteps echoed off the wet tiles, deliberate and measured. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. The same presence I'd felt in the pool was now confined in this small, windowless space with me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to continue dressing, my fingers trembling as I struggled with my shirt buttons. The footsteps stopped directly behind me, close enough that I could hear his breathing, Slow, controlled, watching. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I could feel his eyes boring into my back, studying me with the same predatory focus he'd shown in the pool. My hands shook as I grabbed my wet swimming clothes and shoved them into my bag. When I finally worked up the courage to glance in the fogged mirror mounted on the wall, I caught a glimpse of his reflection, still wearing those impenetrable goggles, his mouth curved in what might have been a smile. I left without looking back, pushing through the door with such force it slammed against the wall. Outside, my family was clustered together near the hotel entrance, their faces tight with concern. "He followed you in there, didn't he?" my mother asked, though her expression said she already knew the answer. The violation felt complete. He'd marked us somehow, claimed us as his target. Lucy announced she needed the bathroom, and we all started walking toward the ladies' restroom near the hotel lobby. But as we approached, our collective breath caught. There he was again, the same man from the pool and changing room, loitering near the entrance to the women's facilities. He wasn't trying to hide his presence. If anything, he seemed to want us to see him there, to understand that nowhere was safe from his attention. My mother's protective instincts kicked in immediately. "I'm going with you," she told Lucy, taking her hand firmly. As they disappeared inside, the rest of us waited in the corridor, my Aunt Beverly wrapping her arms around Iris protectively. The man made no attempt to leave or even look away from us. He simply stood there, motionless and patient, like a predator confident in its eventual success. When my mother and Lucy emerged from the bathroom, my mother's face was ashen. "There was a woman in there," she whispered urgently as we huddled together. "Middle-aged, maybe 45. She came in right after us and went into a stall, but left the door wide open. Just stood there staring at me for the longest time before finally closing the door. Something's very wrong here. We need to get back to the lodge immediately." The walk back to our lodge usually took about 8 minutes through the winding forest path. A pleasant stroll we'd made countless times over the years. But today, every step felt measured and watched. The canopy above filtered the late afternoon light into strange shifting patterns that played tricks on our peripheral vision. Branches seemed to move when we weren't looking directly at them, and the usual birdsong was conspicuously absent. We were barely 50 meters from the hotel when I spotted her. The woman from the bathroom was following us, maintaining a distance of maybe 30 feet. Close enough that we could see her clearly, but far enough to maintain the pretense that our paths just happened to coincide. She was tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair pulled back severely, and clothes that looked expensive but practical, the kind of outfit someone might wear for hiking or hunting. Her gait was wrong. She didn't walk like someone out for a casual stroll or even someone trying to get somewhere specific. Her movements were deliberate and predatory, each step placed carefully and quietly. She kept her head up, scanning the area constantly, but her attention always returned to us. It was the focused attention of someone tracking prey, calculating distances and opportunities. "Don't look back," my father whispered, but it was impossible not to. Every few seconds, one of us would glance over our shoulder to find her still there, matching our pace exactly. When we slowed down, she slowed down. When we picked up speed, she adjusted accordingly. There was no pretense anymore. She was hunting us, and she wanted us to know it. The forest path forked in several directions, offering multiple routes back to the lodge area. In previous years, we'd enjoyed exploring these different trails, discovering scenic viewpoints and hidden clearings. Now, each junction felt like a trap. We chose the most direct route home, hoping to minimize our exposure, but she seemed to know the trail system as well as we did. At one point, she disappeared entirely. For maybe 2 minutes, we thought we'd lost her, walking faster and breathing a bit easier. Then Iris spotted her again. She had taken a parallel path and was now ahead of us, emerging from a side trail that would put her between us and the lodge. The tactical nature of her movement was chilling. This wasn't random stalking. It was a coordinated hunt. By the time we reached the cluster of lodges, our nerves were completely frayed. We could see our building, Lodge Number 7, just ahead, its familiar wooden facade offering the promise of locks and walls between us and whatever these people wanted. But as we approached our front door, fumbling for keys with shaking hands, we realized she was still out there, still watching, still waiting. From the safety of our lodge's front window, we watched the woman with growing dread. She didn't leave when we disappeared inside. Instead, she began what could only be described as reconnaissance. Moving with disturbing purpose, she walked between the lodges in a systematic pattern, pausing at windows, testing door handles, studying the layout of each building like she was memorizing architectural details. The other lodges showed no signs that their occupants were aware of her presence. Curtains remained drawn. Doors stayed closed. The normal sounds of vacation life, television, conversation, children playing, continued undisturbed. We seemed to be the only ones who had noticed this predatory survey of the premises, which made the situation feel even more isolated and hopeless. After maybe 20 minutes of this methodical inspection, she stopped directly in front of Lodge number 6, the one immediately next to ours. For a long moment she simply stood there, head tilted slightly as if listening for something. Then she walked around to the back of the building, disappearing from our view but not from our thoughts. The knowledge that she was so close, separated from us by maybe 30 feet and some wooden walls, made my skin crawl. When she reappeared, she was walking straight toward the forest that bordered all the lodges on their rear sides. The tree line was dense and dark, a wall of pine and birch that stretched for miles into the highland wilderness. In all our years of coming here, none of us had ever seen anyone enter those woods. There were no marked trails, no signs indicating they were open to guests, and something about the forest itself seemed to discourage exploration. But she walked into the trees without hesitation, as if she knew exactly where she was going. Within moments the shadows swallowed her completely, leaving only the gentle swaying of branches to mark her passage. The forest seemed to close behind her like a curtain, and suddenly the woods felt alive with hidden presence. Every shadow could be concealing watchers. Every rustling branch could mark someone moving through the undergrowth. "Where did she go?" Lucy asked, pressing her face against the window. Why did she go in there? None of us had answers, but we all felt the same creeping certainty that she hadn't gone far. She was still out there, somewhere in that maze of trees directly behind our lodge, probably watching us through the windows we couldn't see from inside. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows that made the forest even more impenetrable. Soon it would be completely dark, and we'd have no way of knowing where she was or what she was planning. The woods that had always seemed like a natural barrier, protecting the lodges from whatever lay beyond, now felt like a hiding place for predators who knew the terrain better than we did. Night fell over the lodge like a suffocating blanket, bringing with it a silence that felt unnatural and oppressive. We'd eaten dinner in tense quiet, jumping at every small sound. The settling of the wooden structure, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant hoot of an owl. By 9 o'clock we were all exhausted from the constant state of alertness, but none of us wanted to go to bed. Iris had been the first to retreat to her room, claiming she needed to charge her phone and maybe try to get some sleep. Her bedroom was on the second floor, facing the back of the lodge where the forest pressed closest to the building. The windows were large, designed to let in maximum natural light during the day, but at night they became dark mirrors that could hide anything lurking outside. We were settled in the main living area, clustered around the television but not really watching, when the knocking started. It wasn't the polite rap of someone at the front door. This was something else entirely. Heavy, deliberate blows against glass that seemed to echo through the entire structure. The sound was wrong, too loud and too forceful for human knuckles. Iris appeared at the top of the stairs within seconds, her face white with terror. "Someone's outside my window," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They're knocking on the glass really hard." The knocking continued as she spoke, a rhythmic pounding that seemed designed to shatter more than just windows. It was meant to shatter our sense of safety, our belief that walls and locks could protect us. I followed her upstairs, my heart hammering against my ribs with each step. Her room was at the far end of the hallway, and with every step closer, the knocking grew louder and more insistent. By the time I reached her doorway, the sound was deafening, like someone taking a sledgehammer to the glass. But when I looked at the windows, they showed no signs of damage, no cracks or stress marks that should have resulted from such violent impacts. "Open the curtains," I told myself, though every instinct screamed against it. My hands trembled as I grasped the heavy fabric, knowing that whatever was out there was probably waiting for exactly this moment. When I finally pulled the curtains aside, the darkness beyond was absolute. The security lights that normally illuminated the rear of the lodge were either broken or blocked, leaving only an impenetrable wall of black that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. But I could feel something out there, a presence pressing against the glass, close enough to touch if not for the barrier between us. The knocking had stopped the moment I opened the curtains, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse. Whatever was outside knew we were looking now, knew we were aware of its presence, and that knowledge seemed to satisfy it in some horrible way. The rest of the family had gathered behind me, clustering in the doorway like frightened animals. "What do you see?" my father whispered, but I couldn't answer because I wasn't sure I was seeing anything at all. Just darkness, so complete it seemed solid, and the terrible certainty that something in that darkness was looking back at us. My father and I armed ourselves with the most powerful flashlights we could find. Heavy-duty LED units meant for camping that could cut through the highland darkness like searchlights. The moment we stepped outside, the night air hit us with a sharp coldness that seemed to seep through our clothes and settle in our bones. Every breath created clouds of vapor that obscured our vision and made us feel even more vulnerable. The beam of my flashlight swept across the area beneath Iris's window, illuminating patches of disturbed earth and compressed grass that definitely hadn't been there that morning. But it was my Aunt Beverly who made the discovery that turned our concern into genuine terror. "Over here," she called from about 20 feet away, her voice tight with fear. "You need to see this." In the soft earth near the tree line, our flashlight beams revealed two distinct sets of footprints. One set was clearly made by hiking boots with aggressive tread patterns, the kind of footwear someone would choose for navigating rough terrain. The other set was smaller, made by what looked like running shoes, but both sets showed the same purposeful stride pattern. These weren't the wandering tracks of lost hikers or casual walkers. They were the deliberate paths of people who knew exactly where they were going. The prints led away from our lodge in a straight line toward the forest, disappearing into the undergrowth where the ground became too hard and root-tangled to hold impressions. But their direction was clear. Whoever had made these tracks had approached our building from the woods, spent time directly beneath Iris's window, and then retreated back into the darkness from which they'd come. As we stood there studying the evidence, lights began flickering on in the other lodges. First one window, then another, until nearly every occupied building in the cluster showed signs of awakened inhabitants. People were opening curtains, stepping onto porches, scanning the area with their own flashlights. Whatever was happening wasn't isolated to our family anymore. The entire community of guests had been disturbed by something. The sound that cut through the night air next made us all freeze in terror. The deep rhythmic thrum of helicopter rotors approaching fast and low. Within minutes, a police helicopter appeared over the tree line, its powerful searchlight sweeping back and forth across the lodge area in methodical patterns. The aircraft circled repeatedly, focusing its attention on the forest behind the buildings and occasionally hovering in place as if the crew had spotted something of interest. "They're looking for someone," my father said, stating the obvious but somehow making it feel more real. This wasn't our imagination or paranoia. Law enforcement was actively hunting for dangerous individuals in our immediate vicinity. The helicopter's presence should have been reassuring, but instead it confirmed our worst fears. We weren't safe. We had never been safe. And whatever was out there in the woods was significant enough to warrant a police manhunt. We hurried back inside and secured every possible entry point, placing chairs against doors and checking window locks twice. My father found a large glass jar in the kitchen and balanced it precariously on top of the front door handle. A primitive but effective early warning system that would crash to the floor if anyone tried to force entry while we slept. Morning came with deceptive normalcy. Bright Scottish sunlight streaming through our windows and the cheerful sounds of birds returning to their usual routines. We had spent the night in shifts, someone always awake and watching, but nothing else had disturbed our fragile peace. The helicopter had departed sometime before dawn, leaving behind only the memory of its searchlights and the terrible questions about what it had been hunting. We were packing our belongings, eager to leave this place that had transformed from a beloved retreat into a source of nightmares. When the lodge cleaning service arrived, the housekeeper was a local woman named Mrs. Caldwell, who had been maintaining these properties for over a decade. She was typically cheerful and talkative, but today her face was grave with the weight of terrible news. "I'm afraid there's been an incident," she began, setting down her cleaning supplies with unusual care. "The family staying in lodge number 6, the one right next to yours, they've been found dead. All three of them, a couple and their teenage daughter, visiting from Edinburgh." The words hit us like physical blows, confirming our worst fears while somehow making them infinitely worse. The details she shared made our blood freeze. The family had been discovered by another guest who noticed their rental car hadn't moved in 2 days and became concerned enough to call the management. When authorities entered the lodge, they found a scene of calculated brutality that suggested the killers had taken their time, drawn out the violence for reasons no sane person could understand. The police believe it was a man and woman working together. Mrs. Caldwell continued, her voice dropping to a whisper as if speaking too loudly might somehow summon the killers back. They'd been watching the lodges for days, studying the guests, choosing their target. Security cameras at the hotel caught footage of them casing different buildings, following families, learning routines. The description she provided matched our stalkers perfectly. The man with the goggles from the pool, the woman who had followed us through the forest. They hadn't been random criminals looking for an easy burglary. They had been hunters, selecting prey with the patience and precision of apex predators. The family in Lodge 6 had simply been unlucky enough to fit whatever criteria these monsters used to choose their victims. But why kill them? My mother asked, though her voice suggested she didn't really want to know the answer. If it was just a robbery, why the violence? Mrs. Caldwell's expression grew even darker, if that was possible. The police don't think robbery was the primary motive, she said. Nothing valuable was taken. The killing was the point. They enjoyed it. As we loaded our car and prepared to leave, I couldn't stop thinking about proximity and luck. Lodge 6 was maybe 30 feet from Lodge 7. If the killers had chosen to go left instead of right when they approached the building cluster, if they had decided our family looked more vulnerable than the other one, if any of a dozen small variables had been different, we would have been the ones discovered by concerned neighbors. The drive home was conducted in shell-shocked silence, each of us lost in thoughts too dark to share. The Highland Mountains that had seemed so majestic on our arrival now appeared threatening, full of hidden spaces where predators could watch and plan, and wait for the perfect moment to strike. Even now, months later, I wake up sometimes thinking about those woods behind the lodge, wondering if the killers are still out there, still hunting, still choosing their next victims with the same methodical patience they had used on us. We never went back to Scotland. Some places, once poisoned by terror, can never be reclaimed. But sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I still hear the sound of knocking on glass and wonder if we were ever really as safe as we believed. I'll begin by saying that for context, my family was never particularly religious when I grew up, despite living smack dab in the middle of the South. We attended church sporadically, mainly for appearances rather than genuine worship. The most religious thing we'd ever done was being forced to attend a highly televised megachurch in my home city because my grandmother loved the social status it provided, not because she actually wanted to worship respectfully. She enjoyed being seen in the front rows, wearing her finest clothes, nodding along to sermons she never truly absorbed. The hypocrisy of it all became clear to me as I grew older, watching her gossip about fellow congregants in the church parking lot immediately after services ended. Our household operated on a foundation of conditional love and emotional manipulation. My parents wielded guilt like a weapon, their voices rising and falling in predictable patterns of anger and disappointment. Dinner conversations were minefields, where any wrong word could trigger hours of screaming matches. My father would slam his fist on the table, causing the dishes to jump and rattle, while my mother would retreat into icy silence that could last for days. The walls of our house seemed to absorb these toxic exchanges, creating an atmosphere thick with unresolved tension and resentment. I learned early to read the subtle signs of an approaching storm. The way my father's jaw tightened when he came home from work, the sharp edge in my mother's voice when she asked about my day, the way they moved around each other like opposing magnets. Their bedroom door would slam shut at night, and I would lie in my bed listening to their muffled arguments through thin walls, their words becoming an incomprehensible rumble of anger and accusation. School provided little refuge. I was an average student, neither excelling nor failing dramatically enough to draw attention. Teachers saw me as quiet and compliant, never realizing that my silence stemmed from the chaos I left behind each morning and would return to each afternoon. Friends were casual acquaintances at best. I never invited anyone over, terrified of what they might witness. The shame of my home life created a barrier between me and meaningful connections with peers. The weight of this isolation pressed down on me constantly. I developed habits of hypervigilance, always scanning rooms for exits, always preparing for the next emotional explosion. My stomach lived in a constant state of tension, churning with anxiety that manifested as frequent headaches and an inability to eat regular meals. I would hide in my room for hours, losing myself in books and music, anything to drown out the sound of my parents' deteriorating relationship. As I entered my early 20s, the dysfunction only intensified. My parents' expectations for my future became another battlefield, with career choices and life decisions scrutinized and criticized with brutal efficiency. Nothing I accomplished was ever quite enough, and every failure was dissected and analyzed until I felt like a specimen under a microscope. The emotional abuse was subtle but relentless, a constant drip of criticism disguised as concern, love offered with strings attached, approval dangled like a carrot I could never quite reach. This all took place around 3 years ago, during a particularly dark period in my life when everything seemed to be falling apart simultaneously. It was 2021, a time when my mental state and relationship with my parents had reached a breaking point. The arguments had escalated beyond typical family disagreements into something more sinister and damaging. Words were chosen specifically to wound, secrets weaponized, and trust systematically eroded until our home felt more like a war zone than a place of shelter. My mother had perfected the art of passive-aggressive warfare, delivering cutting remarks with a smile, and following them with "I'm just concerned about you, honey." My father preferred the direct approach, explosive outbursts that left everyone walking on eggshells for days afterward. The combination was toxic, creating an environment where I felt constantly under siege, never knowing which version of my parents I would encounter on any given day. But the breaking point came when I received a phone call that shattered what remained of my emotional stability. My friend James, someone I had known since high school and had recently begun dating, had taken his own life. The news hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs and leaving me gasping on the kitchen floor where I had answered the phone. The caller's voice seemed to come from very far away, explaining details I couldn't process, offering condolences that felt meaningless against the magnitude of my shock. James had been struggling with depression, but he had hidden it well behind a facade of humor and optimism. We had spent the previous weekend together, laughing over dinner, making plans for a camping trip the following month. He had kissed me goodbye on Sunday evening, telling me he would call me soon. There had been no signs, no warnings, no indication that he was planning to end his life just 3 days later. The guilt consumed me immediately and completely. I replayed every conversation, searching for clues I had missed, signs I should have recognized. Had I been too self-absorbed with my own family problems to notice his pain? Could I have said something different, done something more? The questions tormented me, creating a spiral of self-blame that fed on itself, growing stronger with each passing hour. My parents' reaction to my grief was characteristically self-centered. My mother worried about how his death would reflect on our family, concerned that people might think we had somehow contributed to his depression. My father dismissed my tears as dramatic and suggested I should get over it quickly to avoid dwelling on negativity. Their inability to provide comfort during my darkest hour drove home the reality that I was truly alone in my suffering. The funeral was a nightmare of barely contained hysteria. I sat in the back row, watching James's family receive condolences from a steady stream of mourners, all of whom seemed to have stories about his kindness and humor. I wanted to scream at them all, to tell them how wrong they were, how they had failed him just as I had. Instead, I sat in silence, my hands clenched so tightly in my lap that my fingernails drew blood from my palms. After the service, I drove aimlessly for hours, eventually finding myself parked outside the restaurant where James and I had shared our last meal together. The building looked exactly the same, but the world felt fundamentally altered, as if the color had been drained from everything I could see. I sat in my car until well past midnight, crying until my eyes burned and my throat was raw from sobbing. In the weeks following James's funeral, my soul felt utterly dragged down with the weight of grief and guilt. The days blended together in a haze of barely suppressed anguish, and normal activities felt impossible to navigate. Eating became a chore that required tremendous effort, and even simple conversations with coworkers or acquaintances felt like elaborate performances where I pretended to be a functioning human being. Eventually, the grief began to manifest in my dreams. At first, they were relatively normal, simple replays of memories with James, conversations we had shared, moments of laughter that now felt like mockery. But gradually, these dreams began to change, taking on a darker quality that left me feeling more exhausted upon waking than I had been when I went to sleep. The transformation started subtly. In dreams where I was reliving happy memories with James, shadows would begin to creep in around the edges of my vision. The bright restaurant where we had eaten dinner would slowly dim, the cheerful chatter of other diners fading to an ominous silence. James's voice would become distorted, his words echoing strangely as if spoken through water or from a great distance. Then came the universal element that would define all future nightmares, the progressive darkening that seemed to devour light itself. The room, or whatever setting I found myself in, would begin to lose illumination in a way that defied natural explanation. It wasn't like a sunset or the gradual dimming of electric lights. It was as if darkness itself was a living entity, actively consuming brightness and warmth and hope. All my dreams occurred in first-person perspective, making the experience intensely personal and terrifying. The dark haze would start at the periphery of my vision, like peripheral vision gradually failing, but far more menacing. It would creep inward with deliberate malevolence, and I could feel it approaching even when I couldn't see it directly. The sensation was similar to knowing someone was staring at you from behind, but magnified 100-fold. As the darkness encroached, I would begin to feel an indescribable dread welling up in my stomach. It started as a cold, heavy sensation, like swallowing ice water on an empty stomach, but it quickly evolved into something far worse. The feeling was accompanied by the absolute certainty that something terrible was about to happen, though I never knew what. My dream body would tense in preparation for an attack that hadn't yet materialized, every nerve-ending screaming warnings I couldn't heed. The most disturbing aspect was what happened to other people in these dreams. If there were people present when the darkness began its assault, friends, family members, strangers, they would either vanish completely or undergo a horrifying transformation. One moment they would be normal, speaking and moving naturally, and the next they would be gone as if they had never existed at all. Worse were the times when they didn't disappear. Instead, they would turn to face me with expressions completely devoid of life or emotion. Their eyes would become glassy and unfocused, their faces slack and empty. They would stand perfectly still, staring at me with those dead eyes, their mouths hanging slightly open as if they had forgotten how to close them. The sight was infinitely more terrifying than if they had simply vanished. But the worst part was yet to come. The feeling that would grip me as the darkness completed its conquest of my dream landscape. It began as an intensification of the pins and needles sensation you might experience when a limb falls asleep, but it quickly became something far more sinister. The sensation grew heavier and more oppressive, as if invisible hands were pressing down on my entire body with increasing force. This crushing feeling was accompanied by the most pure, concentrated terror I had ever experienced. It wasn't fear of a specific threat or danger. It was existential dread, the absolute certainty that I was in the presence of something that wished me the most profound harm imaginable. My dream self would try to scream, to run, to fight back, but I was completely powerless against whatever was attacking me. The paralysis was complete and absolute. I couldn't move my arms or legs, couldn't turn my head, couldn't even open my mouth to cry for help. It was as if my body had been encased in invisible concrete, leaving only my mind free to experience the full horror of my situation. The helplessness was almost as terrifying as the attack itself. As weeks passed, the dreams not only continued but intensified in both frequency and violence. What had begun as occasional nightmares became a nightly ordeal that I dreaded with every passing hour of daylight. The knowledge that sunset would eventually arrive filled me with a growing panic that made it difficult to concentrate on even the simplest daily tasks. The sound element became more prominent and more disturbing. Along with the crushing sensation and the visual darkness, I began to hear what could only be described as a combination of television static and the deafening song of cicadas, but amplified beyond any natural level. The noise would start as a barely perceptible whisper, like tuning into a radio station just slightly off frequency, but it would quickly build to an overwhelming roar that seemed to originate from inside my own skull. This auditory assault made it impossible to think clearly or form coherent thoughts. Any attempt to pray, to call for help, or even to understand what was happening to me, was drowned out by the relentless electronic screaming. It was as if the sound was specifically designed to prevent me from accessing any mental resources that might help me fight back or escape. The physical sensations also evolved, becoming more specific and more terrifying. Instead of just the general crushing feeling, I began to experience what felt like actual hands grabbing me, their grip cold and impossibly strong. These phantom hands would focus on different parts of my body, sometimes wrapping around my wrists and ankles to hold me in place, other times encircling my throat with gradually increasing pressure. The strangling sensation was particularly horrifying because it felt completely real. I could feel individual fingers pressing into the soft flesh of my neck, cutting off my air supply with surgical precision. My dream body would thrash and struggle, but the hands were immovable, maintaining their grip no matter how desperately I fought against them. I would wake up gasping and clawing at my throat, my hands searching for attackers that weren't there. Sleep became an enemy to be avoided at all costs. I developed elaborate rituals designed to postpone the inevitable, staying up until exhaustion made consciousness impossible, drinking excessive amounts of caffeine, engaging in any activity that might keep my mind occupied. But eventually, my body would surrender to its need for rest, and the nightmares would claim me once again. The worst part was the consistency of the experience. Unlike normal dreams, which tend to be chaotic and unpredictable, these nightmares followed the same pattern every single time. The setting might change. Sometimes I would be in my childhood bedroom, other times in unfamiliar locations, but the sequence of events was always identical. Darkness, dread, paralysis, assault, and then the struggle to wake up. Even when I managed to force myself awake, the terror didn't end immediately. I would lie in bed for hours, afraid to close my eyes, afraid to move, afraid that the slightest relaxation of vigilance would allow the nightmare to resume exactly where it had left off. And often, that's exactly what would happen. If I fell back asleep too quickly, the dream would pick up in mid-attack, as if whatever was tormenting me had simply been waiting patiently for my return. The lack of quality sleep began to take a serious toll on my physical and mental health. My immune system weakened, leaving me susceptible to every minor illness that circulated through my workplace. My appetite disappeared almost entirely, and I lost significant weight in a very short period of time. Coworkers began to comment on my appearance, asking if I was feeling well, but I had no way to explain what was happening to me without sounding completely insane. My relationship with my parents deteriorated even further as my behavior became more erratic and my tolerance for their emotional manipulation reached zero. I would snap at them over minor issues, my exhausted mind unable to maintain the careful diplomatic balance that had previously kept our household relatively peaceful. Their response was predictably self-centered. They accused me of being dramatic, of using my grief as an excuse for bad behavior, of being disrespectful and ungrateful. The breaking point came during a particularly vicious argument with my parents over my attitude problem. My father had cornered me in the kitchen, his face red with anger as he listed my various failures and shortcomings. My mother stood behind him, nodding in agreement and adding her own criticisms whenever he paused for breath. The noise of their voices combined with my severe sleep deprivation created a sensory overload that triggered something close to a panic attack. I found myself backing toward the door, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I tried to process their words. But instead of their familiar voices, I began to hear that horrible static sound from my dreams, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. The kitchen lights seemed to dim, and for a terrifying moment I thought the nightmare was beginning to bleed into my waking life. Without a word of explanation or goodbye, I turned and ran to my room, throwing whatever belongings I could fit into 2 suitcases. My parents followed me, their voices reaching new levels of outrage as they demanded to know what I thought I was doing. But I couldn't respond coherently. All I knew was that I had to get out of that house immediately, before the darkness that haunted my dreams found a way to manifest in reality. I called my friend Bethany while sitting in my car in the driveway, my engine running and my few possessions piled in the back seat. Bethany was someone I had known since college, a deeply religious woman whose faith had always puzzled and slightly intimidated me. She lived alone in a small cabin about 2 hours away from the city, in an area so rural that GPS signals were unreliable and neighbors were measured in miles rather than feet. When I explained my situation, or at least the parts I could explain without sounding completely unhinged, Bethany didn't hesitate to offer me her spare room. She had always been generous and kind, but I sensed that her invitation came from something deeper than mere friendship. It was as if she recognized something in my voice, some quality of desperation that resonated with her own experiences. The drive to Bethany's cabin took me through increasingly isolated countryside, past farmland that stretched to the horizon and small towns that seemed frozen in time. With each mile I traveled away from the city, I felt some of the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. The radio reception faded to static, then disappeared entirely, leaving me alone with my thoughts for the first time in weeks. Bethany's cabin was everything she had described and more. Nestled in a grove of ancient oak trees, the single-story structure looked like something from a fairy tale, with a wraparound porch and flower boxes under every window. The interior was cozy but sparse, decorated with handmade quilts and wooden furniture that Bethany had crafted herself. The most prominent feature was a large wooden cross hanging above the fireplace, its simple design somehow conveying both strength and peace. The bedroom she offered me was actually a converted loft space, accessible by a narrow staircase and furnished with just a twin mattress, a small dresser, and a single window that looked out over the surrounding forest. The space was cramped but private, and for the first time in months, I felt like I might be able to breathe normally again. Bethany respected my need for space and didn't press me for details about what had driven me from my family home. She prepared simple meals and invited me to join her, but didn't take offense when I sometimes preferred to eat alone. Her routine was structured around prayer and Bible study, activities she engaged in quietly and without fanfare. I found the rhythm of her daily life oddly comforting, even though I didn't understand or share her faith. For the first few nights in the cabin, I slept better than I had in weeks. The complete silence of the rural setting was initially unsettling. I had grown accustomed to the constant background noise of city life, but it gradually became soothing. The air was cleaner and cooler, and the absence of streetlights meant that true darkness fell with the sunset, a natural rhythm that my exhausted body gratefully embraced. But I should have known that the peace wouldn't last. Whatever had been tormenting me in my dreams wasn't tied to a specific location. It had found me wherever I was, and geographic distance wouldn't be enough to keep it at bay. I had simply delayed the inevitable confrontation, and when it finally came, the isolation that had initially felt protective would become a source of additional terror. The first few weeks at Bethany's cabin passed in a haze of recuperation and cautious optimism. My body slowly began to recover from the months of sleep deprivation and stress, and I found myself able to eat regular meals and engage in simple conversations without feeling completely overwhelmed. Bethany's gentle presence was like a balm to my frayed nerves, and her unwavering faith provided a sense of stability that I hadn't realized I was desperately craving. The cabin itself became a source of comfort and fascination. Built by Bethany's grandfather in the 1940s, it had been lovingly maintained and gradually modernized while preserving its rustic charm. The walls were lined with knotty pine that had aged to a warm golden color, and every room smelled faintly of wood smoke and lavender from the sachets Bethany kept in the linen closets. The isolation that had initially seemed daunting began to feel like a blessing. The nearest neighbor was Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who lived alone with her collection of rescue cats, and her small farmhouse was barely visible through the trees, nearly half a mile away. The main road was even farther, and during the day the only sounds were natural ones: birdsong, rustling leaves, the distant lowing of cattle from a farm several miles down the valley. I established routines that helped anchor me to this new, peaceful existence. Each morning I would make coffee and sit on the front porch, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The beauty of these moments was almost overwhelming after the urban grayness I had left behind. I began to understand why Bethany had chosen this life of solitude and simplicity. My loft space became a sanctuary where I could read, write in a journal I had started keeping, or simply lie on the small bed and listen to the sounds of the forest. The single window provided a perfect frame for the changing seasons, and I found myself marking time by the subtle shifts in the color of leaves and the migration patterns of birds. Bethany and I developed an easy rhythm of coexistence. She would rise early for morning prayers, then tend to her small vegetable garden or work on various craft projects. I learned that she supported herself through an online business selling handmade soaps and candles, work that allowed her to maintain her chosen lifestyle of rural isolation. In the evenings, we would often sit together on the porch, sharing simple meals and comfortable conversation. It was during these evening talks that I began to open up about my nightmares, though I was careful to downplay the more disturbing aspects of my experiences. Bethany listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of sympathy. When I mentioned my complete lack of religious background, she didn't try to convert me or launch into theological discussions. Instead, she simply shared her own story of finding faith during a difficult period in her young adult life. Bethany's approach to religion was gentle and personal rather than evangelical. She prayed quietly before meals and spent time each day reading her well-worn Bible. But she never made me feel excluded or pressured to participate. Her faith seemed to provide her with a deep sense of peace and purpose that I envied, though I couldn't imagine ever achieving that kind of spiritual certainty myself. As the weeks passed, I began to believe that I had truly escaped the nightmares that had tormented me for so long. I was sleeping through the night regularly, waking refreshed and optimistic about the day ahead. The weight of grief over James's death was still present, but it had transformed from a crushing burden into a manageable sadness that no longer threatened to overwhelm me completely. I started making plans for the future. Perhaps I would stay in the area permanently, find work in one of the small towns nearby, build a life based on simplicity and peace rather than the constant stress and conflict I had known before. The idea of remaining close to Bethany and her stabilizing influence felt like the first genuinely positive decision I had made in years. But as the saying goes, pride comes before a fall. My growing confidence in my recovery was about to be shattered in the most terrifying way possible. The entity that had been haunting my dreams was far from finished with me, and my peaceful interlude at the cabin was about to end in a confrontation that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality and the power of evil. The night that everything changed started like any other. Bethany had gone to spend the evening at Mrs. Patterson's house, helping the elderly woman with some household repairs, and staying overnight to keep her company. This was a regular occurrence, part of Bethany's commitment to being a good neighbor and providing assistance to those who needed it. I had grown comfortable with these occasional nights alone in the cabin. The isolation that would have terrified me in my previous state now felt manageable and even enjoyable. I had planned to spend the evening reading, perhaps writing in my journal, and getting an early night's sleep. It had been over a month since my last nightmare, and I had begun to believe that chapter of my life was finally closed. How wrong I was. That particular evening began with an unusual sense of restlessness that I couldn't quite identify or shake. As sunset approached, I found myself pacing the small confines of the cabin, unable to settle down with a book or any other activity that normally brought me comfort. The forest outside seemed unusually quiet. Even the ever-present chorus of insects had fallen silent, creating an atmosphere of expectancy that made me increasingly nervous. I tried to dismiss these feelings as residual anxiety from my months of trauma, but some primal part of my brain was sending urgent warning signals that I couldn't ignore. The very air in the cabin felt different, charged with an electricity that made my skin feel tight and my nerves hypersensitive. Every small sound, the settling of the wooden frame, the whisper of wind through the eaves, seemed magnified and significant. As darkness fell, I forced myself to go through my normal bedtime routine, hoping that familiar actions would calm my growing unease. I brushed my teeth, changed into comfortable sleeping clothes, and climbed the narrow stairs to my loft space. The small room that had been my refuge for weeks suddenly felt confining and vulnerable, its single window now appearing as a potential point of entry for something I couldn't name. I lay down on the twin mattress and tried to focus on my breathing, using relaxation techniques I had learned years earlier during a brief experiment with meditation. But instead of bringing peace, the exercise only heightened my awareness of how alone I was, how far from help, how completely cut off from any possibility of rescue if something were to go wrong. Despite my anxiety, exhaustion eventually overcame my hypervigilance, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. But this time, there was no gradual transition into the nightmare state I had grown to dread. Instead, it was like being thrown into the deep end of a pool, sudden, shocking, and completely disorienting. In the dream, I found myself stumbling out of the cabin in a state of panic, my movements clumsy and desperate as I fumbled for my car keys. The familiar landscape of Bethany's property looked wrong somehow. The trees too tall, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. The very ground beneath my feet soft and unreliable as if it might give way at any moment. I managed to reach my vehicle and threw myself behind the wheel, my hands shaking so violently that I could barely insert the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I pressed the accelerator to the floor, sending gravel flying as I tore down the narrow dirt road that led away from the cabin. The speedometer climbed to dangerous levels, but I couldn't make myself slow down. Some terrible urgency was driving me forward, though I had no idea where I was going or what I was fleeing from. In the dream, I was frantically trying to call Bethany on my cell phone, my fingers stabbing at the buttons as I tried to maintain control of the vehicle. When she finally answered, her voice was warm and concerned, asking what was wrong, why I sounded so frightened. I tried to explain that I was driving myself to the hospital, that something terrible was about to happen, but my words came out in a jumbled rush that probably made no sense. Then Bethany's voice began to change, the familiar warmth draining away and being replaced by something cold and malevolent. Her words became distorted, as if the phone connection was failing, but underneath the static, I could hear something else, a deep guttural growling that seemed to come from some impossible depth. The sound was definitely not coming through the phone. It was behind me, in the car, breathing down my neck with predatory patience. The darkness that had become my constant tormentor in dreams began its familiar assault. But this time it was more aggressive, more immediate. The headlights of my car cut out without warning, plunging the road ahead into absolute blackness. I frantically tried every switch and button on the dashboard, but nothing would bring the lights back. The speedometer was still showing dangerous speeds, but I could no longer see where I was going. My vision began to narrow as the supernatural darkness encroached from all sides, creating a tunnel effect that grew smaller and smaller with each passing second. The terror that gripped me was beyond anything I had experienced in previous nightmares. This wasn't just fear of the unknown, but the absolute certainty that I was about to be destroyed by something that had been hunting me for months. Then came the touch that changed everything. For the first time in any of my dreams, I felt physical contact that was unmistakably real and unmistakably hostile. A massive hand, far larger than any human hand could be, slid through my hair at the back of my head. The fingers were long enough that they could rest at the base of my skull while still reaching my forehead, and I could feel what could only be described as claws lightly scraping against my skin. The hand gathered a fistful of my hair and yanked my head back with brutal force, pressing me against the seat of the car with such violence that I could feel my neck straining at an impossible angle. The grip was iron strong and growing tighter, and I knew with horrible clarity that this thing, whatever it was, could snap my neck as easily as breaking a twig. The growling sound grew louder and more distinct, resolving into what might have been words in some language I didn't recognize. But even without understanding the specific meaning, the message was crystal clear. This entity hated me with a purity and intensity that was beyond human comprehension. Its hatred was absolute, focused, and deeply personal, as if my very existence was an affront that demanded punishment. The crushing sensation that had tormented me in previous dreams was magnified 100-fold. I felt as if I were being compressed from all directions by invisible forces. My chest constricted until each breath was a monumental struggle. My mouth opened in what should have been a scream, but no sound emerged. Even my voice had been stolen by this thing's power. In that moment of absolute helplessness, I remembered something Bethany had told me during one of our evening conversations. She had mentioned that when faced with spiritual attack, believers could call upon God to send protection, specifically mentioning Saint Michael and the Holy Spirit. At the time, I had listened politely but dismissed the idea as religious superstition. Now, with no other options available, I found myself crying out silently for help from a God I wasn't even sure I believed in. The prayer was desperate and completely sincere. I promised that if this entity could be driven away, if I could be saved from this torment, I would believe forever. I would dedicate my life to faith, to service, to whatever was required in exchange for rescue from this nightmare that had become my reality. The response was immediate and unmistakable. As soon as I called out to God, the grip on my hair began to loosen, slowly and reluctantly, as if the thing holding me was being forced to release its hold against its will. The crushing sensation around my chest eased, allowing me to draw deep, gasping breaths. The horrible growling faded to a whisper, then disappeared entirely. I woke up completely, sitting bolt upright in my small bed with my heart hammering against my ribs. But the terror didn't end with waking. If anything, it intensified, because I realized that the feeling of being watched, of being in the presence of something malevolent, was still there. The nightmare was over, but the threat was not. I sat frozen in my small bed, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid to do anything that might draw attention to myself. The loft space was illuminated only by starlight filtering through the single window, creating a dim gray landscape of familiar furniture that now seemed alien and threatening. Every shadow could be hiding something. Every creak of the old cabin could be a footstep approaching my vulnerable position. Then I saw them, 2 points of red light visible through the window that faced the forest. At first I tried to convince myself that they were some kind of reflectors, perhaps from a piece of farm equipment or a road sign, catching the moonlight in an unusual way. But as my eyes adjusted and focused, the horrible truth became undeniable. They were eyes. Enormous, malformed eyes that glowed with their own internal fire, staring directly at me through the glass. The entire eyeball was red. Not just the iris but the whites as well, as if they were filled with blood rather than normal fluid. They were easily 3 times the size of human eyes, set in a head that I could barely make out in the darkness but which appeared grotesquely oversized and misshapen. The geometry of the situation was all wrong. The loft window was on the 2nd story of the cabin, at least 12 feet off the ground, and there were no trees close enough to support something of human size. Whatever was looking at me had to be standing on the ground, which meant it was tall enough to peer over the windowsill with ease. Based on the angle of its gaze, I estimated that the thing had to be at least 8 or 9 feet tall. We stared at each other for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Those red eyes showed no emotion, no malice, no satisfaction at having found me. They simply observed with the cold calculation of a predator studying its prey. There was intelligence behind them, but it was alien and hostile, completely devoid of anything I could recognize as mercy or compassion. With shaking hands, I reached for my cell phone, never taking my eyes off the window. My fingers fumbled with the device as I tried to navigate to Bethany's contact information, my fine motor control compromised by the adrenaline flooding my system. When I finally managed to place the call, she answered on the second ring, immediately alert despite the late hour. "Something's here," I whispered into the phone, my voice barely audible even to myself. "It's outside my window, watching me. I can see its eyes." Bethany didn't waste time asking for explanations or suggesting rational alternatives. The urgency in my voice must have conveyed the reality of my terror, because she immediately began organizing her response. She told me she was leaving Mrs. Patterson's house immediately and would be back at the cabin within 20 minutes. In the meantime, she instructed me to put the phone on speaker and not to hang up under any circumstances. As I placed the phone on the small dresser beside my bed, Bethany's voice filled the cramped loft space with prayers and scripture verses. She quoted passages about protection and deliverance, her voice strong and confident even coming through the tiny speaker. She instructed me to repeat certain phrases after her, words that felt foreign on my tongue but which seemed to carry weight and power beyond their simple meaning. Following Bethany's guidance, I found a small bundle of white sage that she had given me weeks earlier, explaining that it was traditionally used for cleansing spaces of negative energy. With trembling hands, I lit the dried herbs with a book of matches, filling the loft with sweet, pungent smoke. The familiar smell was comforting, and I found myself breathing more easily as the smoke drifted around the small space. Gradually, the oppressive atmosphere that had filled the cabin began to lift. The air felt lighter, less charged with malevolent electricity. When I finally worked up the courage to look toward the window again, the red eyes were gone, leaving only empty darkness beyond the glass. The sense of being watched, of being in immediate danger, faded until it was completely absent. By the time Bethany arrived at the cabin, her headlights cutting through the darkness as she pulled into the gravel driveway, the entire experience felt like it might have been an elaborate hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. But when she climbed the stairs to my loft and saw my face, she knew immediately that what I had experienced was real and significant. We spent the rest of the night talking, with Bethany sharing stories of her own encounters with spiritual warfare, and explaining the theological framework that helped her understand such experiences. She spoke about the reality of evil in the world, about the ongoing battle between forces of light and darkness, about the power available to those who called upon divine protection with genuine faith. For the first time in my life, these concepts didn't sound like abstract religious theory. They felt like practical information that could mean the difference between safety and destruction. I had experienced something that couldn't be explained by psychology or coincidence, and Bethany's faith-based understanding was the only framework that made sense of what had happened to me. In the days that followed, I began attending the small country church where Bethany worshipped, a simple white building that served a congregation of fewer than 50 people. The pastor was a kind, elderly man who had spent his entire career ministering to rural communities, and his sermons focused on practical applications of faith rather than complex theological arguments. I started reading the Bible, beginning with the Gospels, and gradually working my way through both the Old and New Testaments. The words that had once seemed archaic and irrelevant now carried personal meaning, especially passages dealing with protection from evil and the power of prayer. I developed my own evening prayer routine, specifically asking for protection through the night and expressing gratitude for my deliverance. The nightmares stopped completely. Not gradually, not with occasional relapses, but immediately and permanently. Whatever had been tormenting me for months seemed to understand that I was no longer an easy target, that I had found a source of protection it couldn't overcome. My sleep became peaceful and restorative, and I began to regain the physical and emotional strength that had been slowly drained away during my ordeal. My relationship with my parents remained difficult, but I found that I no longer needed their approval or validation to feel worthwhile. The spiritual foundation I was building provided a source of strength and identity that couldn't be shaken by their criticism or manipulation. I was able to establish boundaries and maintain them without feeling guilty or inadequate. 6 months later, I moved into my own apartment in a small town about 30 minutes from Bethany's cabin. It was a simple one-bedroom place above a local bakery, but it felt like a palace compared to the emotional chaos of my childhood home. I found work at the town's small library, a peaceful job that allowed me to help people while maintaining the quiet, contemplative lifestyle I had grown to value. Bethany and I remained close friends, meeting regularly for meals and conversation. Her influence on my life had been transformational, not because she had tried to convert me, but because she had shown me what genuine faith looked like in practice. Her peace, her strength, her unwavering conviction that good would ultimately triumph over evil, these qualities had given me a roadmap for building my own spiritual life. I still pray every night before going to sleep, a practice that has become as natural and necessary as brushing my teeth. The prayers aren't elaborate or formally structured, usually just a simple request for protection and an expression of gratitude for another day of safety and peace. But they serve as a reminder that I am not alone in the world, that there are forces of good that are stronger than any evil I might encounter. Some people might dismiss my story as a psychological breakdown followed by a religious awakening, and I understand their skepticism. Mental health is a serious issue, and I don't want to suggest that all emotional or psychological problems can be solved through faith alone. But I know what I experienced, and I know what ended that experience. When you're facing something that wishes you harm with an intensity that defies human understanding, you learn to recognize the difference between imaginary fears and genuine spiritual threat. The entity that tormented me was real, it was evil, and it was actively working to destroy my peace, my sanity, and potentially my life. Only when I called upon divine protection was I able to break free from its influence. My life now is simple but fulfilling. I work at the library, tend a small garden behind my apartment, participate in church activities, and maintain meaningful friendships with people who share my values. The dramatic trauma that drove me to Bethany's cabin feels like something that happened to a different person, though I carry the lessons I learned from that experience with me every day. I still miss James, and I probably always will. But the guilt and despair that once threatened to consume me have been replaced by a sense of purpose and hope. I believe that his death, while tragic, served as a catalyst that ultimately led me to discover spiritual resources I never knew existed. In some way, his loss contributed to my salvation, and I honor his memory by living the kind of life he would have wanted for me. The most important lesson I learned is that evil is real, but it is not the strongest force in the universe. When confronted with genuine malevolence, we are not powerless. There are sources of help available to those who ask with sincere faith. The protection I found didn't come from my own strength or cleverness, but from a divine power that responds to genuine cries for help. That knowledge has given me a confidence and peace that no amount of therapy or medication could have provided. I sleep well every night, knowing that I am watched over by forces that are stronger than any nightmare. And in the morning I wake up grateful for another day of life, another opportunity to grow in faith, another chance to help others who might be struggling with their own battles against darkness. Some nights when the wind is strong and the old building creaks and settles around me, I remember those red eyes staring through Bethany's cabin window. But instead of feeling afraid, I feel grateful. Grateful for the experience that taught me about spiritual warfare. Grateful for Bethany's friendship and guidance. And most of all, grateful for the protection that surrounds me now and always. The darkness is still out there, still seeking those it can devour, but it has no power over those who walk in the light, who call upon divine protection, who understand that faith is not just a comfort but a weapon against the forces that would destroy us. I am no longer afraid because I am no longer alone, and that makes all the difference in the world. The woods have always been my sanctuary. For as long as I can remember, I've found solace among the trees, their quiet presence a balm for my troubled mind. But on that fateful day in 1996, the forest's familiar embrace turned into something far more sinister, forever changing my perception of the world around me. I had returned from a tour in Bosnia about a year earlier, and to say I was struggling to readjust would be an understatement. The horrors I'd witnessed, the things I'd done, they clung to me like a second skin, impossible to shed. The doctors called it PTSD, but that clinical term failed to capture the essence of my daily struggle. Every mundane task felt like navigating a minefield. Each unexpected sound a potential trigger for memories I desperately wanted to forget. Walking became my therapy. I'd lace up my boots and head out, seeking the deepest, most remote trails I could find. My preferred spot was a little-known path off Ridgeway Peak, just north of Oak Ridge, Tennessee. It was the kind of place locals avoided, its reputation tainted by whispers of government testing during the Cold War, abandoned missile silos, and clandestine black ops. Most dismissed these stories as baseless conspiracy theories, but I knew better. My time in Bosnia had taught me that the government had secrets they'd kill to protect. I'd been part of missions that left me with more questions than answers. Cleanup operations in areas where locals spoke of unnatural occurrences. The details were always classified, but the body count was real enough. That morning I packed light, just a water bottle, my trusty Swiss Army knife, and an old map I'd gotten from a ranger years ago. The trail wasn't marked on most current maps, which suited me just fine. By noon, I was deep in the heart of the forest, at least 5 or 6 miles from the nearest road. The air was unusually thick and humid for an autumn day in Tennessee, and sweat soaked through my jacket as I pushed on. As I reached a small clearing, something changed. The temperature dropped dramatically, as if I'd stepped into a walk-in freezer. I glanced up, expecting to see cloud cover, but the sky remained clear and blue. An eerie silence descended, absent of even the faintest rustle of leaves or chirp of birds. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I pressed on, approaching a ridge the locals called Disappearing Ridge. The name had always seemed like just another bit of local color, but as I neared the top I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood about 50 yards ahead, tall and dressed in dark clothing, but it was the face, or lack thereof, that truly terrified me. From that distance I couldn't make out any features, just a blank expanse where a face should have been. I blinked, and in that instant the figure vanished. My heart raced as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. A PTSD-induced hallucination? A trick of the light? But deep down, I knew this was different. It felt too real, too present. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the ridge and descend the other side where the dense tree cover would offer some sense of protection. As I crested the ridge, I noticed something else: footprints. They were fresh, leading off the path and into the thick underbrush. The size and depth of the impressions were unsettling. Whoever or whatever had left them was unnaturally heavy. The boot tread sinking deep into the soft earth. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to retreat to the safety of civilization. But a morbid curiosity honed by years of confronting the unexplainable propelled me forward. I followed the tracks, pushing through dense foliage and scrambling over moss-covered rocks. With each step I felt as if I was leaving the world I knew behind, venturing into a realm where the normal rules no longer applied. The forest grew darker, the trees pressing in closer, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. After what felt like hours of hiking, the trail ended abruptly at the edge of a small ravine. What I saw at the bottom made me question everything I thought I knew about the area's history. Half hidden by overgrown vegetation was a bunker, its rusted metal door slightly ajar. I'd heard rumors of old government facilities in these hills, but seeing one in person was something else entirely. I stood at the edge of the ravine for several long moments, weighing my options. The sensible part of me urged caution, insisted that I should walk away and pretend I'd never seen this place, but my training and experiences had shaped me into someone who couldn't ignore such mysteries. With a deep breath, I began my descent into the ravine. The bunker's entrance loomed before me, a dark maw leading into the unknown. The air that seeped out was stale and carried a faint metallic odor that made me think of old blood. I pulled out my flashlight and stepped inside, my eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. The beam of light revealed a scene straight out of a Cold War nightmare. Rows of rusted filing cabinets lined the walls, their contents long since destroyed by time and the elements. Broken equipment lay scattered across the floor, their purposes now impossible to discern. But it was what stood in the center of the room that truly chilled me to my core. A metal table, not unlike those I'd seen in morgues, dominated the space. What set this one apart were the leather straps attached to its sides, cracked and weathered but unmistakably designed to restrain a person or something else. My mind raced back to those classified missions in Bosnia, to the mangled bodies we'd found, and the vague reports of unidentified hostiles or experimental failures that always followed. I was about to turn and leave when I heard it. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, and found myself face to face with the figure from the ridge. Only now, I could see the true horror of its appearance. The face, if you could call it that, was a smooth, featureless expanse. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just blank flesh where features should have been. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. In its hand, the figure clutched a long, wickedly sharp knife that gleamed dully in the beam of my flashlight. I backed away, every nerve in my body screaming for me to run. But there was nowhere to go. The ravine was a dead end, and the only exit was behind this nightmarish entity. It took a step toward me, moving with a slow, almost casual gait, as if it had all the time in the world to corner its prey. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the confined space. I gripped my Swiss Army knife tightly, though I knew it would be little use against the creature's larger blade. There was no response, just that blank face and those relentless, measured steps. My mind raced, searching for a way out of this impossible situation. Then I spotted it, an old rusted pipe jutting from the wall, likely part of the bunker's long-defunct ventilation system. Without thinking, I lunged for it, wrenching it free with strength born of desperation. The creature was upon me in an instant. I swung the pipe with all my might, connecting solidly with its head. The impact would have felled any normal man, but this thing barely staggered. It paused for the briefest moment, then lunged forward with frightening speed, its knife slashing through the air. I felt a searing pain as the blade grazed my arm, but adrenaline kept me moving. Dodging another wild swing, I managed to slip past the creature and bolt for the exit. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, not daring to look back as I scrambled up the ravine and plunged into the forest. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step, but I pushed on. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but the primal fear of what lurked behind me drove me forward. I had no idea how long I ran, or in what direction. The woods all looked the same in my panic, an endless maze of trees and shadows. Finally, miraculously, I stumbled onto a familiar stretch of trail. I chanced to glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that featureless face emerging from the undergrowth. But there was nothing, just the silent, indifferent forest stretching out behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, and even then, I didn't feel safe. I sped away from Ridgeway Peak, not slowing down until I was miles away, and the forest was nothing but a dark smudge in my rearview mirror. In the days that followed, I grappled with what I'd experienced. I reported the bunker to the authorities, but they dismissed my concerns. They claimed it was likely just an old Cold War relic, nothing to be worried about. There was no mention of the faceless figure, the knife, or the strange disappearances that had plagued the area for years. It was as if the entire incident was being swept under the rug, buried under layers of bureaucracy and willful ignorance. I never returned to Ridgeway Peak after that day. The woods I once found so comforting now felt tainted, hiding secrets I couldn't begin to comprehend. But the memory of what I encountered there never faded. In quiet moments, I can still feel the weight of that blank gaze upon me, still hear those measured footsteps echoing in the depths of the forest. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. It shattered my perception of reality, forcing me to confront the possibility that there are things in this world that defy explanation. The government's denial only strengthened my resolve to uncover the truth, though I knew the path would be dangerous. In the years since, I've dedicated myself to researching similar incidents, reaching out to others who've had encounters they can't explain. I've compiled files, cross-referenced reports, and slowly begun to piece together a picture of something much larger and more terrifying than I could have imagined. There are others out there like the creature I encountered, beings that don't fit into our understanding of the world, and there are people, powerful people, who will go to great lengths to keep their existence hidden. But I won't stop searching for answers, because I know what I saw that day in the woods was real, and I know that some secrets don't stay buried forever. As I sit here writing this account, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Perhaps it's just paranoia, a lingering effect of that day in the woods. Or perhaps it's something more. All I know is that the world is a far stranger and more dangerous place than most people realize. And somewhere out there, in the depths of forests or the shadows of abandoned bunkers, there are things waiting to be discovered. Things that might be better left hidden. But I can't turn back now. The truth is out there, buried beneath layers of secrecy and denial. And no matter the cost, I'm determined to uncover it. Because some hunts never truly end, and some hunters never stop pursuing their prey. In this case, I'm not sure if I'm the hunter or the hunted. But I do know one thing: the game is far from over. I don't usually talk about what happened. It's not because I don't want to. Believe me, sometimes I think telling the whole story would take the weight off. It's just that most people won't believe me. They'll nod politely, maybe laugh nervously, and then try to change the subject. But after all these years, I've decided I'll say it exactly how it happened. Maybe it'll make sense to someone else. Maybe it won't, but this is what I know. The year was 1985, late September, and I had just turned 28. My name is Jack Harland, and back then I was working a dead-end job at the Tacoma Steelworks on the outskirts of Tacoma, Washington. Every day was the same, the deafening clang of metal on metal, the acrid smell of burning slag, and the monotonous rhythm of machines that seemed to suck the life out of everything around them. I'd come home each night, my clothes reeking of sweat and steel, feeling like I was slowly being crushed under the weight of my own unfulfilled dreams. My only escape was hiking. The mountains, the woods, those were the places I felt truly alive, away from the cold gray walls of my life. I would often take weekends to explore the Cascade Mountains, going deeper and deeper into the wild, testing my limits, pushing myself farther each time. It was during these solitary treks that I felt most like myself, most connected to something greater than the daily grind that threatened to consume me. That fateful weekend was supposed to be like any other. I had heard about this place, Lake Wenatchee, from a guy at work named Mike. He was one of those old-timers who seemed to know every hidden gem in the state. "Jack," he said to me one day during our lunch break, his voice low as if he was sharing a secret. "You ever been to Lake Wenatchee?" I shook my head, curious. Mike leaned in closer, his eyes glinting with excitement. "It's a hidden gem, I tell ya. Not many people know about it. And it's perfect for camping. Just you in the wilderness. No tourists, no RVs, just pure untouched nature." That sounded like heaven to me. Solitude, peace, a break from everything. I pressed Mike for more details, and he was happy to oblige, sketching out a rough map on a napkin and telling me about the best spots to camp. "Just be careful," he added as an afterthought, his tone suddenly serious. "Nature out there, it's different. Pristine, yeah, but also, I dunno. Just keep your wits about you, okay?" I nodded, not thinking much of his warning at the time. I'd been on plenty of solo hikes before. I knew how to handle myself in the wilderness, or so I thought. That Friday I packed my gear with an excitement I hadn't felt in months. My trusty backpack was filled with all the essentials. A sturdy tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, water purification tablets, first aid kit, and a few other survival items. I also threw in my old Nikon camera, hoping to capture some of the beauty Mike had described. I woke up before dawn on Friday, the anticipation making sleep impossible. The sky was just beginning to lighten as I threw my gear into my beat-up 1972 Ford F-100 pickup. The old truck had seen better days. Its once vibrant blue paint now faded and chipped, but it had never let me down. As I pulled out of my driveway, the familiar rumble of the engine felt like a promise of adventure. The drive was long but scenic. I headed east on Highway 2, watching as the urban sprawl of the Seattle area gradually gave way to smaller towns, then to rolling farmland, and finally to the majestic forests of the Cascades. Endless trees stretched up into the sky, their leaves just starting to turn orange and gold, signaling the onset of fall. The morning mist clung to the valleys, creating an ethereal landscape that seemed to exist outside of time. As I drove, my mind wandered. I thought about my life, about the dreams I'd had when I was younger. I'd always imagined I'd do something more with my life than work in a steel mill. Maybe I'd be a writer, or a photographer for National Geographic, capturing the world's hidden wonders. But life has a way of steering you off course, doesn't it? One compromise here, one detour there, and suddenly you're miles away from where you thought you'd be. I shook off these melancholy thoughts as I neared my destination. This weekend was about escaping all that, about reconnecting with the part of myself that still believed in possibility. I reached the trailhead Mike had described by mid-afternoon. The parking lot was little more than a wide spot in the road, with room for maybe a half-dozen cars. There were only a couple of vehicles there when I arrived, an old Jeep Wagoneer and a battered Volkswagen van that looked like it had seen its fair share of adventures. Perfect. I liked it quiet, just me and the mountains. As I got out of my truck, I took a deep breath, savoring the crisp mountain air. It smelled of pine and earth, with a hint of wood smoke from somewhere distant. The forest loomed before me, ancient and mysterious. For a moment I felt a strange sense of unease. as if the trees themselves were watching me. I brushed it off as pre-hike jitters and began to unload my gear. I strapped on my backpack, its familiar weight settling comfortably on my shoulders. I double-checked my map, an old USGS topographic map that Mike had marked up for me, and made sure my compass was easily accessible. With one last look at my truck, I set off down the trail. The hike itself wasn't too difficult, just a steady incline through thick forest. The trail was well maintained at first, but as I went deeper into the woods, it became less defined. Fallen leaves carpeted the ground, making the path harder to follow. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy that filtered the sunlight into a soft green glow. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then I'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle, and I'd whirl around, half expecting to see something. But there was never anything there, just the endless sea of trees and undergrowth. I tried to focus on the beauty around me instead. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals. A pair of squirrels chased each other up a massive Douglas fir, chattering angrily. A woodpecker's rhythmic tapping echoed through the trees. Once I even caught a glimpse of a deer, its brown coat blending perfectly with the forest as it bounded away at my approach. As the afternoon wore on, the forest began to change subtly. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their trunks gnarled and twisted in ways that didn't seem quite natural. The bird songs that had accompanied me earlier faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I checked my map again, frowning. According to Mike's directions, I should be nearing the lake, but all I could see was more forest. Had I taken a wrong turn somewhere? I was about to turn back when I caught a glimmer of water through the trees ahead. Pushing through a dense thicket, I suddenly found myself on the shore of Lake Wenatchee. The sight took my breath away. The lake stretched out before me, vast and still, its surface like a mirror reflecting the surrounding mountains and the fading purple sky. The last rays of the setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and crimson. I stood there for a long moment, drinking in the view. This, I thought, this is why I come out here. In that moment, all the stress and frustration of my daily life seemed to melt away. I felt small in the face of such natural beauty, but also somehow more alive than I had in years. As the light began to fade, I set about making camp. I found a good spot near the shoreline, sheltered by a stand of towering cedars. I pitched my tent with practiced ease, gathered some firewood, and soon had a cheerful blaze going. Sitting by the fire, eating a simple meal of canned beans and beef jerky, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The night was clear, and as the fire died down, I leaned back to gaze at the stars. Out here, away from the city lights, the sky was a riot of stars, more than I'd ever seen before. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light. That first night was peaceful. The kind of peace you can only find out there, away from people, from noise, from everything. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind rustle through the trees, the occasional splash of fish jumping in the lake. It was perfect. But that peace wouldn't last long. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there in the darkness was watching me, waiting. If only I'd known then what I know now, I would have packed up and left right then. But I didn't, and that decision would change my life forever. I woke early the next morning, just as the first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the trees. The air was crisp and cool, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. As I emerged from my tent, I was greeted by a sight that took my breath away. The lake was shrouded in a thick mist, giving it an otherworldly appearance. The surrounding mountains loomed like silent sentinels, their peaks just visible above the fog. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and strong black coffee, I decided to explore the area around the lake. There were old logging trails that snaked through the woods, some of them barely visible, overgrown with moss and weeds. I chose one that seemed to lead deeper into the forest, away from the lake. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The forest seemed different in the daylight, but not in a comforting way. The trees grew impossibly close together, their branches intertwining in unnatural ways. The undergrowth was dense and tangled, often forcing me to push my way through. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something's not right, but I brushed it off as paranoia. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was just alone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching me from the shadows between the trees. Around midday, I stumbled across something strange. The trail I had been following opened up into a small clearing, and there, half hidden by a dense thicket, stood an old cabin. It was a decrepit thing, looking like it hadn't been touched in decades. The windows were busted out, the door hung crooked on its hinges, and the roof had caved in on one side. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked closer. There were no signs of recent activity, but the place gave me a bad vibe, like I wasn't supposed to be there. The wooden walls were weathered and gray, covered in a thick layer of moss and lichen. As I approached, I noticed something odd about the ground around the cabin. The grass and weeds grew in strange patterns, forming circles and spirals that didn't seem natural. I hesitated at the threshold, every instinct telling me to turn back. But I had come this far, and something compelled me to see what was inside. I pushed open the crooked door, wincing at the loud creak of rusted hinges. The interior of the cabin was mostly empty. Just a few rusted tools and a collapsed table. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through the holes in the roof. The floorboards creaked ominously under my feet as I moved further inside. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. On one of the walls there were carvings, deep jagged marks scratched into the wood. At first I couldn't make out what they were, but as my eyes adjusted to the gloom I realized they were symbols. Not the usual graffiti you'd find in abandoned places, but something older, more sinister. They looked like something you'd see in an old book of folklore or occult practices. I traced my fingers over the symbols, feeling the rough edges of the carvings. They seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and for a moment I could have sworn I heard a faint whispering, just at the edge of hearing. I jerked my hand back, suddenly aware of how silent the forest had become. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, barely noticeable under the musty odor of the cabin, but as I stood there, it grew stronger, a sickly sweet scent, like rotting meat mixed with something I couldn't identify. It seemed to be coming from beneath the floorboards. My heart racing, I backed out of the cabin. I had seen enough. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There, half hidden in the tall grass near the cabin, was a small leather-bound book. I hesitated for a moment before picking it up. The leather was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. I opened it carefully, afraid it might crumble in my hands. The pages were filled with dense, handwritten text in a language I didn't recognize. Interspersed with the writing were more of those strange symbols I had seen carved into the cabin walls. Some of the pages contained crude drawings, misshapen creatures that looked like a nightmarish blend of human and animal. I don't know why I took the book. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe some part of me knew it might be important later. Whatever the reason, I slipped it into my backpack before heading back towards my campsite. The hike back seemed to take longer than it should have. The forest felt different now, more oppressive. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. More than once I found myself taking wrong turns, ending up in unfamiliar clearings or dense thickets. It was as if the forest itself was trying to keep me from leaving. By the time I made it back to my camp, the sun was already starting to dip below the horizon. The lake, which had seemed so peaceful the night before, now looked dark and forbidding. The surface was unnaturally still, not even a ripple disturbing its glassy surface. I built a fire, more for comfort than warmth, and tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me. As the flames flickered, casting dancing shadows across my campsite, I took out the book I had found. In the firelight, the symbols on its cover seemed to writhe and shift, as if alive. I opened it again, flipping through the pages, trying to make sense of the strange text and disturbing images. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my heart stop. It was a scream, high-pitched and terrified, cutting through the stillness of the night. It seemed to come from somewhere across the lake, in the direction I had hiked earlier that day. The sound echoed across the water, fading into an eerie silence that was somehow worse than the scream itself. I sat there, frozen, straining my ears for any further sound. But there was nothing. Just the crackle of my fire and the pounding of my own heart. I debated what to do. Should I try to find the source of the scream? But it was dark, and I didn't know the area well. Plus, something in my gut told me that whatever had caused that scream was not something I wanted to encounter. I spent a restless night, jumping at every sound, my mind conjuring terrifying scenarios. When dawn finally broke, I made a decision. I needed to leave this place. Something was very wrong here, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what. But as I began to pack up my camp, I realized with growing horror that things were not as I had left them. My backpack, which I was sure I had left inside my tent, was sitting outside, its contents strewn across the ground. And there, in the soft earth around my campsite, were footprints. But they weren't human footprints, nor any animal tracks I recognized. They were weird, like a mix between a man and something else. They were too large to be human, and too defined to be a bear's. What chilled me to the bone was the realization that whatever had made those prints had walked right up to my tent while I slept. The tracks showed that it had stopped right at the entrance, stood there for who knows how long, and then turned back. I felt my stomach twist as I stared at those unnatural footprints. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. I should have left right then. Packed up and hiked back to the car, but something kept me there. I don't know if it was curiosity or stupidity, but I stayed. My hands shook as I gathered my scattered belongings, shoving them haphazardly into my backpack. The leather-bound book I'd found at the cabin seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and I hesitated before packing it away. Part of me wanted to leave it behind, to sever any connection with the strangeness I'd encountered, but another part, a part I didn't fully understand, insisted I keep it close. As the morning wore on, I tried to convince myself that there was a logical explanation for everything. Maybe it was just an animal I'd never encountered before. Maybe the scream was just a bird or some other wildlife. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. That afternoon, driven by a morbid curiosity I couldn't shake, I decided to explore the far side of the lake, away from where I had gone the day before. As I hiked along the shore, the air grew thick, almost oppressive. It was like the forest itself was closing in around me, the trees leaning in, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. I could feel eyes on me again, that same sensation of being watched. But every time I stopped to look around, I saw nothing but endless trees and undergrowth. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my feet and my own ragged breathing. It was around 3 p.m. when I heard it. A scream, high-pitched and terrified, cutting through the stillness of the woods. It was the same sound I'd heard the night before, but this time it was close, maybe a few hundred yards away. My blood ran cold, and for a moment I couldn't move. Then, without thinking, I ran toward the sound. My heart pounded in my chest, and branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I burst into a clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. In the middle of the clearing lay a body. A man, face down in the dirt, his clothes torn to shreds. I approached cautiously, my whole body trembling. I knelt down, steeling myself as I rolled him over. His face, I'll never forget his face. It was twisted in horror, eyes wide open, mouth frozen mid-scream. But it wasn't just the expression that haunted me. His skin was pale, almost translucent, with strange vein-like markings spreading across his face and neck. Whatever had done this wasn't human. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I needed to get out of there. I needed to leave. But as I turned to run, I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the shadows of the trees, something stood watching me. It was tall, unnaturally tall. Its body lanky and distorted, like it didn't quite belong in this world. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, they glowed. An unnatural, sickly yellow fixed on me with a predatory intensity. It didn't move. It just watched. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were made of lead. But then something inside me snapped, and I bolted. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, crashing through the trees, branches slashing at my face and arms. I didn't stop until I reached the lake. I didn't go back to camp. I didn't grab my gear. I just kept running, following the shoreline until I found the trail back to the parking lot. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my heart pounding in my chest, my lungs burning. As I fumbled with my keys, I glanced back at the forest. For a split second, I thought I saw a pale figure standing between the trees, those yellow eyes gleaming in the shadows. But when I blinked, it was gone. I drove straight to the nearest town, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. I went directly to the sheriff's office, burst through the door and spilled out my story in a frantic jumble of words. I told them everything about the cabin, the footprints, the body, the creature. The sheriff, a weathered man named Jim Hawkins, listened patiently, his face impassive. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Son," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I've been sheriff in these parts for nigh on 30 years. I've heard all sorts of stories about those woods. Strange lights, weird sounds, people gone missing, but I've never found anything to back up those tales." I opened my mouth to protest, but he held up a hand to stop me. "Now, I'm not saying I don't believe you saw something out there. These woods, they can play tricks on a man's mind, especially when you're out there alone. But a body? A monster? That's a serious claim. We'll send a team out to investigate, but I wouldn't get your hopes up." I could tell from his tone that he didn't believe me. Not really. They'd go through the motions, maybe send a couple of deputies to poke around the lake, but they wouldn't find anything. Whatever was out there, it was too smart, too otherworldly to leave evidence for the local police to find. I never went back to that lake. I never went hiking again. The memory of what I saw that day, of those glowing yellow eyes watching me from the shadows, haunted my dreams for years. A few months later, I heard about a couple of hikers who went missing in the same area. Their bodies were never found. The sheriff chalked it up to accidents, maybe a bear attack, but I knew better. Whatever I saw that day, whatever killed that man, it was still out there, lurking in the woods, waiting for its next victim. I left Tacoma not long after that. Couldn't stand to be so close to those mountains anymore. I moved east, tried to start a new life, but the memories followed me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the echo of that inhuman scream ringing in my ears. It wasn't until years later that I finally worked up the courage to open that leather-bound book again. I'd kept it all this time, hidden away in the back of my closet. As I flipped through the yellowed pages, I began to understand bits and pieces of the text. It spoke of ancient beings, older than humanity, that slumbered in the deep places of the world. It talked about rituals to awaken them, to harness their power, and it warned of the consequences. I realized then that what I had encountered in those woods was just the tip of the iceberg. There were things out there, ancient and powerful, that defied our understanding of the world. And sometimes, if you're not careful, you might just stumble upon them. So yeah, I don't tell this story often. Most people don't believe me, and I don't blame them. It's easier to dismiss it as the ramblings of a madman than to accept that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that challenge everything we think we know. But if you ever find yourself near Lake Wenatchee, do yourself a favor. Stay away from the far side of the lake. Don't go looking for that cabin. And if you hear a scream echoing through the trees, run. Run as fast as you can, because once you see what I saw, once it knows you're there, it won't stop until it gets what it wants. And trust me, you don't want to know what that is. It's been almost 40 years since that fateful weekend at Lake Wenatchee, but the memories haven't faded. If anything, they've grown sharper, more vivid with time. I'm an old man now, my hair gray, my hands not as steady as they once were. But my mind is as clear as ever, especially when it comes to those 3 days in September 9th. I've spent decades trying to make sense of what happened, to find some explanation that fits within the bounds of what we consider normal. I've read countless books on local legends, on cryptozoology, on the occult. I've reached out to experts in fields ranging from biology to parapsychology, but nothing quite fits. Nothing explains what I saw in those woods. The leather-bound book I took from the cabin has been both a blessing and a curse. Over the years, I've managed to decipher more of its contents, though much of it remains a mystery. It speaks of things that shake the very foundations of what I thought I knew about the world. Ancient beings, older than time itself, slumbering in the dark places of the earth. Rituals and sacrifices to awaken them, to harness their terrible power. But for every answer the book provides, it raises a dozen more questions. Who wrote it? How did they come by this knowledge? And why was it left in that dilapidated cabin in the middle of nowhere? I've thought about turning the book over to authorities, to scientists who might be able to make more sense of it. But every time I consider it, I'm held back by a deep-seated fear. What if it falls into the wrong hands? What if someone tries to use the knowledge it contains? The consequences could be catastrophic. So I keep it hidden, locked away where no one else can find it. It's my burden to bear, I suppose. My penance for stumbling into something I never should have seen. I've tried to move on with my life, to put the past behind me. I left Tacoma, moved across the country, started a new career. I even got married, had kids. But the shadow of what happened at Lake Wenatchee has always loomed over me. My wife, Ex-wife now. She tried to understand, but how could she? How could anyone who wasn't there that day? Over the years, I've kept tabs on the area around Lake Wenatchee. I've collected newspaper clippings, police reports, anything I can find about strange occurrences in those woods. The missing hikers I heard about shortly after my experience weren't the last. Every few years, someone else disappears. Sometimes they're found, confused and disoriented, with no memory of where they've been. Sometimes they're never seen again. The official explanations are always the same. People get lost in the woods all the time. Wild animals, accidents. But I know better. I know what's really out there. I've thought about going back, facing my fears, confronting whatever it is that lurks in those woods. But every time I consider it, I see those glowing yellow eyes in my mind. And I know I can't. I'm not the young man I once was. If I couldn't outrun it then, I certainly can't now. So I do the only thing I can. I warn people. I tell my story to anyone who will listen, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I can prevent someone else from stumbling into the same nightmare I did. Most people don't believe me, of course. They smile politely, maybe humor the old man for a while, but I can see it in their eyes. They think I'm crazy, or senile, or both. But every once in a while, I see a flicker of recognition in someone's eyes, a hint of fear, quickly masked. And I wonder, have they seen it too? Are there others out there who have encountered the things that lurk in the shadows of Lake Wenatchee? I may never know the full truth of what happened to me all those years ago. I may never understand the nature of the creature I saw, or the significance of the symbols in that old cabin. But I know what I saw. I know what I experienced. And I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation. Things that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. So if you're ever in the Pacific Northwest, if you ever find yourself drawn to the pristine waters of Lake Wenatchee, remember my story. Remember that sometimes the most beautiful places hide the darkest secrets. And if you hear a scream echoing through the trees, if you feel eyes watching you from the shadows, don't hesitate. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because once you've seen what's out there, once it knows you're aware of its existence, it will never stop hunting you. And trust me, there are some things in this world that are better left undiscovered. As for me, I'm an old man now. My adventuring days are long behind me. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself back in those woods. I feel the oppressive silence, smell the dank odor of that old cabin, see those terrifying yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness. And I wonder, is it still out there? Is it waiting? And what will happen when there's no one left who remembers, no one left to warn others of the danger? I suppose in the end that's why I'm finally telling this story in full. Not because I expect you to believe me, but because I hope that maybe, just maybe, it might save someone else from the fate I narrowly escaped. Because the truth is out there, hidden in the shadows of Lake Wenatchee, and sometimes the truth is more terrifying than we could ever imagine. The fluorescent lights of the office buzzed faintly overhead as I finished up my work for the day. It was Friday, and the clock on my computer screen read 6:47 p.m. Most of my coworkers had already left, eager to start their weekends. I stretched, feeling the satisfying pop in my back after hours of hunching over my keyboard. As I was packing up my bag, my phone started vibrating insistently on the desk. I glanced at the screen, surprised to see Hank's name flashing. Hank and I had been best friends since college, but he usually texted rather than called. A twinge of concern flickered through me as I answered, "Hey Hank, what's up?" Instead of Hank's usual cheerful greeting, I was met with heavy breathing and the sound of rustling leaves. When he finally spoke, his voice was tense and slightly breathless. "Mike, thank God you picked up. I need your help. Something's happened." I frowned, my hand pausing as I was zipping up my laptop bag. "Are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm at Buckner Forest Preserve," Hank replied, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I came out for a hike after work to clear my head, But I found something really messed up. I called the police, but they think I'm pulling some sick prank. They won't listen." My stomach tightened at the panic in his voice. Hank wasn't the type to get worked up over nothing. "Slow down," I said, trying to keep my own voice calm. "What did you find?" There was a long pause, filled only by the sound of Hank's ragged breathing. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. A body, Mike. I found a body. And Jesus, it's not like anything I've ever seen before. This wasn't an accident or an animal attack. Someone or something did this on purpose. A chill ran down my spine. Hank, are you sure? Maybe it's... I'm sure. He cut me off, his voice hardening. I know what I saw. Will you come out here, please? I don't know what to do, and I don't want to be alone out here. I glanced at my watch, then out the window at the fading daylight. Every instinct told me this was a bad idea, that I should tell Hank to get out of there and meet me somewhere safe. But the fear in my friend's voice overrode my reservations. Okay, I said, already heading for the elevator. Text me your exact location. I'm on my way. As I drove toward Buckner Forest Preserve, my mind raced with possibilities. Maybe Hank had stumbled upon a horrific crime scene. Or maybe I tried to reassure myself. This was all some kind of misunderstanding. Perhaps he'd found an animal carcass in the dim light, and his imagination had run wild. The preserve was about a 40-minute drive from my office in Chicago. As I left the city behind, the buildings gave way to suburbs, and then to stretches of farmland interspersed with patches of forest. The sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks that seemed at odds with the growing sense of dread in my chest. I turned off the main highway onto a smaller road that wound through dense woods. The trees pressed close on either side, their branches reaching over the pavement like grasping fingers. As darkness fell, I flicked on my high beams, the bright light cutting through the gloom ahead. Finally, I spotted Hank's blue Subaru parked at a small trailhead pullout. I pulled in beside it, noticing with unease that his was the only other vehicle there. Grabbing my phone and a flashlight from the glove compartment, I stepped out into the chilly evening air. Hank, I called out, sweeping my flashlight beam across the tree line. Where are you? Over here. His voice came from somewhere to my left, farther down the trail. Follow the path. I'll flash my light so you can see me. I saw a beam of light flicker between the trees about 100 yards away. Taking a deep breath, I started down the narrow dirt trail, leaves crunching beneath my feet. The woods seemed to close in around me, the darkness beyond my flashlight beam almost palpable. Every rustle and snap made me jump, imagining eyes watching me from the shadows. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, I rounded a bend and saw Hank. He was standing near the base of a large oak tree, his own flashlight clutched tightly in his hand. As I approached, the beam of light illuminated his face, and I was struck by how pale and drawn he looked. Mike, he said, relief evident in his voice. Thanks for coming. I'm sorry to drag you out here, but I didn't know what else to do. I clasped his shoulder, trying to offer some reassurance. It's okay. I'm here now. Tell me what's going on. Hank ran a shaky hand through his hair. I was just trying to clear my head after a rough day at work, you know. I've hiked out here plenty of times before, but I went off the main trail, wanting to explore a bit. That's when I found it. He gestured vaguely deeper into the woods. It's about a quarter mile that way. I can show you, but are you sure you want to see it? It's pretty bad. I hesitated, a part of me wanting nothing more than to grab Hank and get the hell out of there. But I knew I couldn't leave without understanding what had shaken my friend so badly. Yeah, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Show me. Hank nodded grimly and started leading the way, his flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the forest floor. We pushed through dense underbrush, the branches seeming to claw at our clothes. The air grew colder and damper as we moved deeper into the woods, and an oppressive silence settled around us, broken only by our labored breathing and the occasional snap of a twig beneath our feet. Finally, Hank came to a stop in a small clearing. There, he said quietly, pointing his flashlight beam toward the base of a gnarled old tree. I followed the light, my eyes struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. At first it looked like a tangle of roots and debris, but as I stepped closer, horror washed over me as I realized what I was looking at. It was a body, or what remained of one. The corpse was twisted and contorted in ways that defied human anatomy, limbs bent at impossible angles. But that wasn't the worst of it. The skin had been, I struggled to find the right word, shredded, peeled. It hung in ragged strips, exposing muscle and sinew beneath. Some of these strips had been woven into the branches of the nearby trees, as if in some grotesque attempt at camouflage. I stumbled backward, my stomach heaving. Jesus Christ. I gasped, fighting the urge to vomit. What could have done this? Hank shook his head, his face ashen. I don't know. I've never seen anything like it. That's why I called the police, but they wouldn't listen. They thought I was some kid pulling a prank. I forced myself to look at the body again, trying to approach it with some semblance of objectivity. Could it have been an animal attack? A bear, maybe? No way, Hank said firmly. Look at how the skin is woven into the trees. No animal does that. This was intentional. A chill ran down my spine as I realized he was right. Whatever had done this wasn't just killing for food or in self-defense. This was something else entirely. We need to call the police again, I said, pulling out my phone. But as I looked at the screen, my heart sank. No signal out here. Damn it. Hank nodded grimly. Yeah. I had to hike back to my car to make the call earlier. That's part of why I wanted you to come. I didn't want to leave it unguarded, but I was scared to stay here alone. I understood his fear all too well. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats, and the weight of unseen eyes pressed down on us. Okay, I said, trying to think clearly despite the panic clawing at the edges of my mind. We need a plan. We can't just leave this here. But we also can't stay out in these woods all night. Hank opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a twig snapped loudly somewhere in the darkness behind us. We both whirled around, our flashlights cutting through the gloom, but revealing nothing but trees and shadows. Did you hear that? Hank whispered, his voice tight with fear. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. Yeah. It was probably just an animal, right? A deer or something? But even as I said it, I knew I was trying to convince myself as much as Hank. The forest suddenly seemed alive with menace. Every rustle of leaves and creak of branches a potential threat. We should get out of here, Hank said, already backing away from the grotesque scene. Come back in the morning with the police. I was about to agree when something caught my eye. A flash of movement at the edge of my flashlight beam. I swung the light back, illuminating a patch of forest floor about 20 feet away. Wait, I said, grabbing Hank's arm. Look at this. In the soft earth, clearly visible in the harsh glare of our flashlights, was a footprint, but it wasn't like any animal track I'd ever seen. It was massive, easily twice the size of my own foot, with long, cruel-looking claw marks extending from each toe. Hank's breath caught in his throat. What the hell made that? Before I could answer, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the trees. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human, but filled with a primal, predatory malice that sent ice through my veins. Run, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Then, as the growl intensified, I shouted, Run! We took off through the woods, all thoughts of caution forgotten in our blind panic. Branches whipped at our faces and roots threatened to trip us with every step, but we pushed on, driven by pure adrenaline and fear. Behind us, I could hear something crashing through the underbrush. Whatever it was big, and it was fast. The sound of splintering wood and tearing foliage grew closer with each passing second. This way, Hank yelled, veering off to the right. I followed without question, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. We burst out of the tree line into a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and empty. Without a word, we both made for it, praying it would offer some kind of shelter. Hank reached the door first, yanking on the handle. For a heart-stopping moment, it refused to budge. Then, with a groan of protesting wood, it swung open. We tumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind us. Help me barricade it, I gasped, already shoving an old dusty couch against the door. Hank joined me, and together we piled whatever furniture we could find against the entrance. As we worked, the growling outside grew louder. Something heavy slammed against the side of the cabin, making the whole structure shudder. We froze, staring at each other in the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. What do we do now? Hank whispered, his eyes wide with fear. I looked around the cabin, searching for anything we could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on an old fireplace poker leaning against the hearth. I grabbed it, feeling slightly less helpless with its solid weight in my hand. We wait, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Whatever's out there, it can't get in here. We'll wait until morning, then make a run for it. Hank nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. We both knew that if the thing outside really wanted to get in, our makeshift barricade wouldn't hold it for long. As if in response to my thoughts, another impact rocked the cabin. This time I heard the distinct sound of wood splintering. A quick glance confirmed my fears. A large crack had appeared in one of the boarded-up windows. "We need a better plan," Hank said, his voice shaking. "We can't just sit here and wait to die." I nodded, my mind racing. Okay, let's think. There has to be something we can do." As we huddled in the darkened cabin, the sounds of our pursuer circling outside, I couldn't help but wonder how we had ended up in this nightmare. What was that thing out there? And more importantly, how were we going to survive the night? The old cabin creaked and groaned around us, its timbers protesting against the assault from outside. Hank and I huddled near the center of the single room, our eyes darting between the boarded-up windows and the barricaded door. Every few minutes a heavy impact would shake the structure, followed by that bone-chilling growl. "We need to find a way to contact someone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's got to be a landline or a radio or something in here." Hank nodded, his face pale in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the boards. "Good idea. You check that side. I'll look over here." We split up, searching the cabin as thoroughly as we could in the near darkness. I rummaged through drawers and cupboards, finding nothing but dust, cobwebs, and the occasional scurrying mouse. The cabin seemed to have been abandoned for years, its contents long since looted or decayed. "Anything?" I called out to Hank. "Nothing useful," he replied, frustration evident in his voice. "Wait, hold on. I think I found something." I made my way over to where Hank was crouched near an old desk. He held up a battered leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. "A journal?" I asked, peering over his shoulder. Hank nodded, carefully opening the fragile book. "Yeah, looks like it. Maybe it can tell us something about this place, or what's out there." As Hank flipped through the pages, I kept an ear out for any changes in the sounds outside. The creature seemed to have settled into a pattern of circling the cabin, occasionally testing the walls for weakness. I tried not to think about how long our shelter would hold. "Listen to this," Hank said suddenly, his finger tracing a line of faded text. "It's dated about 30 years ago. The sightings are becoming more frequent. The loggers speak of a beast in the woods, something that walks like a man but hunts like no animal they've ever seen. I've tried to warn the Forest Service, but they won't listen. They think it's just superstition, or maybe a bear that's lost its fear of humans. But I know better. I've seen it." A chill ran down my spine. "Keep reading," I urged. Hank turned the page, his brow furrowed in concentration. "There's more. I finally got a clear look at the creature last night. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, with matted fur covering its body. But its face, God help me, its face was almost human. Its eyes gleamed with an intelligence that no mere animal could possess. I know now that the old legends are true. The Wendigo walks these woods." "Wendigo?" I repeated, the unfamiliar word feeling strange on my tongue. "What the hell is that?" Before Hank could answer, a deafening crash echoed through the cabin. We both jumped, whirling to face the source of the noise. One of the boarded-up windows had given way, planks of wood clattering to the floor. In the gap, illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the trees, we caught our first clear glimpse of our pursuer. It was, as the journal had described, massive. Its body was a nightmarish fusion of human and animal features, with elongated limbs covered in matted dark fur. Its face was a twisted parody of human features, with sunken eyes that glowed with an eerie yellowish light. But what struck me most were its hands. Not paws, but hands, ending in wickedly curved claws that looked capable of tearing through flesh and bone with ease. For a moment we all froze, Hank and I paralyzed with fear, the creature seemingly surprised by its sudden intrusion. Then, with a roar that shook dust from the rafters, it began to force its way through the opening. "The back door!" I yelled, grabbing Hank's arm and yanking him towards the rear of the cabin. We had cleared a path earlier during our search, and now we sprinted for our lives, the sound of splintering wood and inhuman snarls close behind us. We burst out into the cool night air, the forest looming dark and forbidding before us. There was no time to think, no time to plan. We simply ran, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs, driven by pure animal instinct to escape. I could hear the creature pursuing us, its heavy footfalls and occasional roars spurring us to even greater speed. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead. but I didn't dare slow down. Beside me, Hank was gasping for air, his face a mask of terror in the intermittent moonlight that filtered through the canopy. We broke through a thicket into a small clearing, and I skidded to a halt. Ahead of us, the ground dropped away sharply, a cliff face, impossible to climb down in the dark. "This way," Hank yelled, veering to the left along the cliff's edge. I followed, my mind racing. We couldn't keep running forever. We needed a plan, a way to lose our pursuer or fight back. As if in answer to my desperate thoughts, I spotted a dark opening in the cliff face ahead, a cave. "There," I shouted to Hank, pointing. Without hesitation, we made for the cave entrance. We ducked inside, just as the creature burst into the clearing behind us. The cave was pitch black, and we pressed ourselves against the cool stone walls, trying to quiet our labored breathing. Outside, we could hear the Wendigo sniffing the air, its growls echoing off the cliff face. "What do we do now?" Hank whispered, his voice barely audible. I fumbled in my pocket, relieved to find my phone still there. The screen illuminated, casting a faint blue glow around us. No signal, of course, but at least we had some light. I switched on the flashlight function, careful to point it away from the cave entrance. The beam revealed a narrow passage leading deeper into the earth. Rough-hewn steps descended into darkness. "We can't stay here," I said, gesturing towards the passage. "It'll find us for sure. Maybe we can lose it in there." Hank nodded grimly, and we started down the steps, moving as quietly as we could. The sounds of the creature outside grew fainter as we descended, replaced by the drip of water and the echo of our footsteps. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the passage opened up into a larger cavern. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the far walls or ceiling, giving the unsettling impression that we were standing on the edge of an abyss. "Look," Hank said, pointing. On the far side of the cavern, barely visible in the gloom, was what looked like a man-made structure, a stone archway carved with intricate symbols. We approached cautiously. The symbols were like nothing I'd ever seen before, a mix of angular lines and curves that seemed to shift and move if I looked at them too long. "What is this place?" I wondered aloud. Hank ran his hand over the carved stone. "Some kind of old mining operation, maybe? Or," he hesitated, "something older." A low rumble from above made us both freeze. Dust and small pebbles rained down from the ceiling. The Wendigo had found the cave entrance. "We need to keep moving," I said urgently. Beyond the archway, the passage continued, sloping gently downward. We hurried through the arch, and I felt a strange tingling sensation as we passed under it, like static electricity dancing across my skin. Behind us, the rumbling grew louder, punctuated by the creature's roars. The passage twisted and turned, leading us deeper underground. We passed more carved symbols on the walls, and occasionally glimpsed side chambers filled with strange, half-glimpsed shapes that I tried not to look at too closely. Finally, we emerged into another large cavern. This one was dimly lit by an eerie greenish glow emanating from pools of still water scattered around the chamber. In the center stood a raised stone dais, upon which rested a pedestal holding something. From this distance, in the poor light, I couldn't make out what it was. "What the hell?" Hank muttered, voicing my own confusion. Before we could investigate further, a deafening roar echoed through the cavern. We spun around to see the Wendigo framed in the passage we had just exited, its eyes gleaming with malevolent hunger. "Run!" I yelled, though there was nowhere left to run to. We sprinted for the dais, hoping to put some obstacle between us and the creature. As we reached the pedestal, I finally got a clear look at what it held. A knife, its blade made of some dark stone that seemed to drink in what little light there was. Without thinking, driven by desperation, I grabbed it. The moment my hand closed around the hilt, a jolt of energy surged through me. The symbols carved into the blade began to glow with the same greenish light as the pools, and I felt a presence in my mind. Ancient, alien, but undeniably powerful. The Wendigo charged, covering the distance between us with terrifying speed. But as it reached the edge of the dais, it suddenly recoiled, as if it had struck an invisible barrier. Knowledge flooded into my mind. Snippets of an alien language. Rituals performed in this very cavern millennia ago. The true nature of the creature we faced. I knew, somehow, that this knife was the key to defeating it. "Hank," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "I need you to trust me. When I tell you to, Push that thing off the dais. He looked at me like I was insane, but nodded. The Wendigo circled us, probing the invisible barrier, searching for weakness. I raised the knife, the words of a chant I had never learned spilling from my lips. The glow from the blade intensified, and I felt power building around us. The barrier flickered. "Now," I shouted. As Hank shoved the creature back, I brought the knife down in a gleaming arc. It bit deep into the Wendigo's chest, and an unearthly howl filled the cavern. Green fire erupted from the wound, spreading rapidly across the creature's body. In moments it was over. Where the Wendigo had stood, there was nothing but a pile of ashes, quickly dissipating in a non-existent wind. Hank and I stood there panting, trying to process what had just happened. The knife in my hand grew cold, the glow fading along with the alien presence in my mind. Is it over?" Hank asked hesitantly. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure. "I think so, but we need to get out of here, and we need to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." We made our way back through the tunnels, emerging into the pre-dawn light. As we hiked back towards our cars, exhausted and shell-shocked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled into something much bigger than we realized. The Wendigo was gone, but I had a sinking feeling that it was just the tip of a very large, very dangerous iceberg. One thing was certain: our lives would never be the same again. And somehow I knew this was just the beginning of a much larger story. In the weeks that followed our harrowing night in Buckner Forest, Hank and I tried to return to our normal lives, but the memory of what we had experienced and what we had learned haunted us. We made an anonymous tip to the police about the body we had found, but by the time they investigated, all traces of the gruesome scene had vanished. The official report chalked it up to a hoax or a case of overactive imaginations. I kept the stone knife hidden away, unable to bring myself to get rid of it but afraid of its power. Sometimes, late at night, I could swear I heard it whispering to me, hinting at other creatures lurking in the dark corners of the world, waiting to be unleashed. Hank threw himself into research, digging into old legends and folklore, trying to find any information he could about the Wendigo and other mythical beasts. He started a blog, ostensibly about cryptozoology, but really a veiled attempt to warn others about what might be out there. As for me, I found myself unable to look at the forests around Chicago the same way. Every shadow held potential threats, every unexplained sound a possible harbinger of terror. But along with the fear came a sense of purpose. We had faced something inhuman and survived. We had protected others from a threat they never knew existed. And deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The knife was proof that there were forces at work in the world far beyond our understanding. Forces that sometimes needed to be confronted by ordinary people, thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Whatever came next, whatever other horrors lurked in the darkness, I knew that Hank and I would face them together. We had been changed by our experience, forged into something new. We were no longer just two friends from Chicago. My boots crunched on the dry autumn leaves as I made my way through the shadowy forest. The sun had nearly set, casting an eerie orange glow through the canopy of bare branches overhead. An unnatural silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional gust of chilly wind that sent dead leaves skittering across the ground. I quickened my pace toward the campsite where the missing hikers had last been seen. When I emerged into the clearing, an uncanny stillness greeted me. 3 tents stood with their flaps whipping in the breeze. Clothing, backpacks, and supplies lay strewn about haphazardly, as if everyone had fled in a panic. Drawing closer, my blood ran cold. Dark stains splattered the torn nylon of the tents. The metallic scent of blood mingled with the loamy richness of the earth. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, just this macabre scene frozen in time, like a crime scene photograph. What the hell happened here? A child's stuffed teddy bear lay abandoned near the cold embers of the fire pit. As I knelt to examine it, a jolt of dread shot through me. Jagged claw marks rent the soft fur, leaking clouds of polyester stuffing. No animal I knew of could have made those cuts. In the gathering darkness, a long, keening howl rose from deep in the woods, sending shivers down my spine. It sounded like no creature I'd ever encountered. Unholstering my pistol, I peered into the murky tree line, my heart hammering. 2 pinpricks of pale light, like eyes, glinted in the underbrush. Then they vanished. Something was out there in the darkness. Something that didn't belong in this world. And it was watching me. I tossed and turned in my sleeping bag that night, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The forest beyond my tent rustled and whispered, as if conspiring against me. My mind churned with grim thoughts of the vacant, blood-soaked campsite. Where had the campers gone? What sort of beast was lurking in these woods? When dawn broke, cold and gray, I radioed back to the ranger station to report my findings. "Hank, you copy? I've got a real bad situation up here. Hikers are missing, campsite's a wreck. Looks like an animal attack, but I ain't ever seen anything like this." "Roger that," Hank replied, his gruff voice crackling over the radio. "Hate to say it, but we've had other disappearances in that area over the years. Folks around here don't much like to talk about it. Well, somebody better start talking, because there's a world of hurt out in these woods, and I'm stumbling around in the dark here." I took a long pull from my canteen, trying to steady my nerves. "Listen, you didn't hear this from me," Hank said slowly, "but the local tribes got legends about those hills. Say there's old evil spirits that roam around up there. Spirits that can look like men, or beasts. They take folks sometimes, especially when the moon's full." Christ almighty, Hank, you trying to give me a heart attack? I'd never put much stock in ghost stories and native lore, but after what I'd seen last night, I wasn't so sure. Later, in a small-town diner off the highway, I found myself sitting across from an ancient Native American man. His weathered face looked like a relief map of the hills themselves. When I told him about the missing hikers and the state of their camp, his dark eyes flashed with something like recognition. "Those who walk like men," he said cryptically, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Wendigos, hungry for human flesh. Once they catch the scent of blood, they never stop hunting." I left the diner with a heavy sense of dread. As I drove back toward the mountains, the old man's words echoed in my skull. I tried to tell myself it was just superstitious nonsense, but I couldn't shake the uncanny feeling that I was driving toward something truly malevolent, something that defied explanation. And as I would soon learn, my darkest fears didn't even touch the horror that awaited me in the shadows of the forest. For 2 days I combed the wilderness, searching for any sign of the vanished campers. With each passing hour, my hopes dwindled. The nights brought a primal, gripping terror. In the inky blackness between the trees, I sensed swift, stalking movements defying natural rhythms. My electric lantern sputtered and died, plunging me into blinding dark. I sprinted by instinct and memory, branches raking my flesh, unseen pursuers racing along my heels. When dawn broke, the true carnage revealed itself. I found the first ravaged deer carcass beside a burbling creek. Its belly hung open in glistening ropes, picked ribs thrusting to the pale sky. As I scouted further, more gruesome remains turned up. A bobcat's severed head ogled eyelessly from a stump. Bones and bloody bits of fur littered a stony gulch. The whole forest reeked of an abattoir. Yet even more unnerving was the way my equipment malfunctioned. Radios spat static. GPS blinked out at key moments. It felt as if the very frequencies of this area had been corrupted by some eldritch force. When a search helicopter whirred overhead, I frantically waved my arms and screamed. It continued unheeding, as though I were invisible. I could swear I heard the pilot's panicked voice squelching through my radio. "No visual, some kind of interference. We gotta turn back," before the signal devolved to a banshee shriek. That evening, the baying started. Anguished human-like wails piercing the twilight. Thrashing and sobbing echoed through the scrub oaks and birches, interspersed with visceral tearing sounds. My skin prickled, a cold sweat drenching my back. I crouched in my tent, pistol aimed at the door, barely daring to breathe. Gnarled shadows crept across the walls like deformed fingers. Then the footfalls thundered past, minus a grotesque blend of animal galloping and humanoid scurrying, before fading to silence. I didn't sleep. How could I? Every fiber of my being thrummed with an instinctive primal panic. The kind our ancestors knew when saber-toothed cats prowled outside their caves. But this was worse, because all my training, all my rationality told me such monsters didn't exist in the modern world. Couldn't exist. Now I knew better. They were here, in my forest, stalking me with calculated cunning, playing with me, hunting me. Exhausted in body and spirit, I stumbled upon a narrow box canyon as the third morning dawned. Towering walls of striated stone rose up claustrophobically tight. I immediately wished I had given the uncanny crease in the landscape a wide berth. The cliffs fairly screamed with primitive etchings, faded ochre pictographs, cavorted and distorted animal-human forms. Skulls and femurs had been pounded into cairn-like stacks, and the petroglyphs, God, those petroglyphs. Frenzied slashes gouged the rock, as if enraged talons had raked it in ritualistic patterns. I couldn't look away from one central glyph that repeated over and over. A stick figure with a wolf-like head and disproportionately long, spindly limbs. Forcing down my revulsion, I scanned the scree at the base of the canyon. A glint of metal caught my eye. Crouching, I brushed aside gravel to reveal a dented camping cookpot and a torn, blood-stained jacket, the same brand as one I had seen at the ravaged campsite. So the lost hikers had come this way. Fresh terror jolted me as I studied the ground. A trail of footprints led deeper into the stony gulch, pressed into the damp earth. They started out as the familiar tread of hiking boots. Then, mid-stride, they distorted, lengthening, sprouting vicious claws, like a human transforming into a beast between one step and the next. I must have made some involuntary noise, because just then a scrabbling issued from a shadowed crevice to my left. I wheeled around, ripping my pistol from its holster. A pale, filthy arm shot out of the narrow crack, grasping weakly. "Help!" The voice was a rasping croak, choked with terror and dehydration. I reached into the crevice, clasped the clammy hand, and pulled. A young man, no more than 20, staggered out and collapsed against me. His eyes rolled wildly in their sockets, clothes hanging off him in shredded tatters. "Easy now," I soothed, even as my own heart jackhammered. "You're safe. I've got you." "No, not safe." He shuddered violently, fingers clawing. "They'll be back. Always come back." Lowering him to the ground, I uncapped my canteen and let water trickle over his cracked lips. He gulped convulsively, dribbling down his stubbled chin. "Who will be back? What happened up here?" His eyes snapped to mine with wild intensity. "Monsters. They killed everyone." A moan escaped him and he doubled over. I struggled to process his fractured account. He described the initial attack, how the shambling nightmares had struck without warning, torn his friends limb from limb with terrifying ease. Their guttural snarls and the screams. Oh God, the screams. The horrors he had witnessed defied belief. Yet one look at the man's shattered psyche told me this was no campfire tale. He had stared into the abyss, and it had stared back, with ravenous, glowing eyes, and a predator's grin. I built a small fire at the base of the cliff, hoping the light and warmth would bring a measure of comfort to the quaking survivor as evening stole over the canyon. He huddled near the flames, knees drawn up to his chest, rocking back and forth. No matter how I tried, I couldn't coax from him a name, or any details about himself. Shock had stolen his identity, leaving only a husk animated by trauma. As the fire popped and hissed, I studied his scratched and bruised face in the dancing light, tried to imagine the horrors he had endured. Were his friends truly gone, shredded and devoured by some unnatural abomination? It sounded preposterous, impossible. Then I remembered the uncanny sights and sounds I myself had witnessed over the preceding days. The spine-chilling howls, the sense of being watched by malevolent eyes. Whatever lurked in this forest, it was no mere animal. Some primal intuition, ancient as encoded self-preservation behavior, screamed at me to flee. But I couldn't abandon this broken man, or the others, if any still lived. So I sat up with my pistol cocked and ready, watching the narrow entrance to the canyon. Moonlight painted the world beyond in slivers of icy blue and impenetrable shadow. An owl hooted forlornly. Wind keened through the rocks. Seconds ticked by with excruciating slowness. When it came silently. One moment the canyon lay still and empty. The next, a towering silhouette filled the gap, blotting out the stars. The thing stepped into the firelight, and my breath seized in my throat. Dear God, no living creature on earth looked like that. It stood on two legs, but the proportions were grotesquely elongated and askew. Sinewy, ashen gray flesh stretched over jutting ribs and an emaciated frame. Lanky arms ended in scythe-like talons. Worst of all was the head, a hellish fusion of wolf and deer skull, dominated by a prognathic maw bristling with jagged teeth. Membranous, tattered ears flicked above deep-set eye sockets that glowed with a feral, flickering emptiness. I raised my pistol and fired, the shot deafening in the confined space. I know I hit the thing square in its vile chest, but it merely flinched. Then that awful death's head swiveled toward me, eyes blazing like cold gashes in the fabric of reality. Behind me, the survivor shrieked. A high, unraveling sound ripped from the depths of madness. He scrabbled to his feet, clawing at the unyielding cliff face. No, 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 not again. The Wendigo. For what else could it be? This storybook demon sprung to nightmarish life, threw back its head and howled with obscene glee. Then it pounced, faster than any human eye could track. I dove aside, years of training taking over. Sparks burst behind my eyes as I slammed into the canyon wall. Dazed, I could only watch as the looming horror fell upon the young man. His scream pierced the night, climbed to an unbearable crescendo, then cut off with a wet, ripping crunch. In that moment, I knew true despair. I had failed this poor soul. Failed as a ranger, as a rescuer, as a human being. Now I would surely join him, torn to quivering gobbets by an insatiable monstrosity. Through tear-blurred eyes, I saw the Wendigo feast, slavering, on the kill. Gore pattered to the stones, hellish shadows capered on the cliff walls, cast by the guttering fire. The scene branded itself into my brain with all the lurid permanence of trauma. Then, suddenly, the creature paused. Its gore-streaked muzzle lifted, swinging from side to side, sniffing the air, seeking a new scent. My scent. It growled, a guttural register more felt than heard, blood dripping from its jaws. It stepped toward me, one taloned hand outstretched, and I ran, heart pounding, gasping for breath. I plunged headlong through the phantasmagoric forest. Gnarled branches snatched at my clothes. Jagged rocks slashed my palms. None of it mattered. Only flight, primal and urgent as a hunted deer. Behind me, crashing footfalls and strident howls shredded the night. Glimpsing back, I saw the Wendigo loping after me, all wrong angles and terrifying speed. Lungs afire, a razor stitch in my side. I broke from the tree line into sudden open space. Skidding to a halt at the crumbling lip of a mining shaft, a surreal sight greeted me. An abandoned prospector camp moldered under the ghostly moon, half devoured by choking vines. Rusted pickaxes and dented cookware littered the ground, and at the camp's heart gaped a black-fanged maw, a cave mouth leading into the bowels of a limestone cliff. The Wendigo's banshee shriek pierced the air, far too close. No time to hesitate. Pulse thudding in my skull, I plunged into that Stygian hole, groping blindly in the dark. My questing fingers found a damp, rocky wall. I followed it, stooped half double, harried by the echoes of monstrosity at my back. Pale light glimmered ahead. The cave opened into a chamber, roof lost in shadow. Animal bones crunched underfoot. A charnel reek blasted my nostrils, triggering the gag reflex. Swallowing bile, I raised my flickering flashlight. What it illuminated defied sanity. A shrine of madness, erected to primal depravity. Skulls. Dozens of human skulls piled in grotesque fused heaps. Broken, fleshless arms and legs thrust from the walls like hellish ornamentation. In sacred niches stood a grisly array of objects. Hiking boots, tattered shirts, shattered GPS units, all crusted in old blood. At the chamber's rear, a vast flat slab bore arcane sigils and glyphs, scrawled as if by a crazed hand, an altar to foulest sacrifice. My brain reeled, struggled to process the spectacle of death. Questions flooded me, even as my skin crawled with horror. How long had this been here? How many victims had the Wendigo claimed over the years? What eldritch intelligence drove it to collect these macabre trophies? Slumped against the altar, I spied two human shapes and my heart clenched. Survivors, I thought of the lost campers, prayed these might be them. Warily approaching, flashlight beam wavering, I called out, "Hello? I'm a ranger. I'm here to help." One figure stirred, whimpered. Slowly it unfurled from a fetal curl. In the stark light, I saw a woman's face. Ashen, streaked with grime, eyes blank beneath a tangled thatch of hair. She looked right through me, catatonic with shock. Her male companion fared worse. He remained motionless, propped against the blood-smeared stone. Only the shallow rise and fall of his chest indicated life. A quick once-over revealed festering gashes, the flesh around them hot with infection. The Wendigo's hunting howl bellowed from the cave mouth. Cursing, I slung the semi-conscious man across my shoulders in a fireman's carry. With my free hand, I hauled the unresponsive woman to her feet. We have to move now. The passageways twisted before us, a stony labyrinth. I blundered on, taking turns at random, pulse drumming a panic tempo. The monster's squalling cries distorted weirdly, seeming to come from all directions at once. Stalactites clawed at my face. The dank air thickened, harder to suck into straining lungs. Just as my knees began to buckle under the double burden, a waft of night wind kissed my cheek. There, a fissure, leading up to faint starlight. Driving my body to a final effort, I squeezed through, pulling my dazed charges behind me. We stumbled out into another part of the forest, far from the mining camp. I didn't stop to get my bearings. Hoisting the survivors once more, I crashed through the underbrush in what I prayed was the direction of my truck. Let it still be there. Let the keys still turn the ignition. Let the Wendigo have sated its bloodlust, for now. At last, with an almost religious gratitude, I spied the glint of chrome through the foliage. Nearly weeping, I hustled the traumatized man and woman into the cab, turned the key, and exhaled a ragged gasp as the pickup roared to life. Stamping the accelerator, I sped off down the overgrown logging road in a spray of gravel. Deliverance. It seemed too good to be true. And of course it was. For a fleeting eternity of minutes, we bounced and clattered along that rough track, night-shrouded trees whipping past. I gulped air, tried to slow my galloping heart. In the passenger seat, the survivors huddled like broken dolls, unspeaking. Their 1,000-yard stares told me they had endured true nightmare and might never emerge from it. I rounded a switchback, tires fighting for traction. The headlights flared across a scene out of hell. The rutted road ahead roiled with shadowy figures. Not quite human, not quite beast. Lupine heads and attenuated limbs glistened wetly in the sallow beams. Eyes flashed like rime-coated rubies. The pack of Wendigos milled and capered, blocking our escape with their very presence. Shit. Shit, shit. I pounded the steering wheel as the engine stalled, sputtered out. Tried the key again. Nothing. Not even a click. Some uncanny agency seemed to have killed the truck, left us stranded. The pack stalked forward, a leisurely sort of menace in their movements. They knew we were trapped, defenseless, lips skinned back from jagged maws in what looked horribly like grins. My flashlight flickered, dimmed. Scrabbling under the seat, I found the flare gun. Loaded it with numb fingers. God, let this work. I leaned out the window, aimed at the lead abomination's head, and fired. The flare seared across the tableau like a comet, brilliant red. It struck the Wendigo square between its malevolent eyes and ricocheted off, spinning away into the darkness. The thing threw back its awful head and laughed. A barking, squalling sound, demented with glee. Then it lunged, talons outstretched. I twisted the key one more time, sobbing a wordless prayer. The pickup roared to life. I punched the accelerator to the floor, and we jolted forward. Momentarily startled, the Wendigos fell back. Claws screeched across the hood, but somehow the truck muscled through, scattering the pack like ninepins. In the rearview mirror, I watched the monstrosities regroup, milling in the red wash of tail lights. Then, as one, they bounded after us, loping on all fours, steadily gaining ground. The road seemed to narrow, trees pressing in on either side. Keening howls and guttural snarls pursued us, the sound of a predator taunting its prey. I downshifted, urged more speed from the straining engine. Sweat stung my eyes, panic clawed at my throat. On and on, we raced through that primordial wood. The implacable horrors always just behind. Time lost meaning, swallowed by the frenzied chase. I existed only as a nerve-stripped creature, every cell locked on the singular goal of survival. It couldn't last. Not at this breakneck pace. Through unfamiliar terrain. Sure enough, as I wrenched the wheel around another blind turn, the road dropped out from under us. An old bridge rotted through. We sailed into space, seemed to hover, then crashed into the stony creek bed with a scream of tortured metal. The impact whiplashed through me, and the world went mercifully black. I don't know how long I drifted in that oblivion. Snatches of consciousness filtered back slowly, painfully. The night breeze on my face, the gurgle of the creek, a metallic tang on my tongue. When I finally pried open my eyes, watery dawn light greeted me. The truck lay crumpled at the base of a steep embankment, accordion folded around an outcropping of schist. I had been flung halfway out the shattered windshield. saved from impalement by some small miracle. Every joint and sinew shrieked as I levered myself to hands and knees. Reality hit like a sledgehammer. The Wendigos. The crash. Where were the survivors? I found them sprawled a few yards away, thrown clear by the impact. The man lay ominously still, limbs akimbo. When I pressed fingers to his throat, they met only doughy skin already cooling to match the rock beneath. Beside him, the woman stirred and whimpered. I cradled her head, checked for obvious wounds. She'd, it's okay, you're safe now, they're gone, praying it was true. She blinked at me, some dim awareness penetrating her stupor. Licked dry, split lips. Gone? A croak, frail with disbelief. I think so. We lost them when the bridge collapsed. I glanced up the steep bank, seeing no signs of pursuit. Looked like the monsters couldn't or wouldn't follow us down here. Maybe running water repelled them, like in the old stories. I laid my palm to her cheek. You're going to be all right. I'll hike out till I find cell reception. Call for help. Everything's going to be... All right? She cut me off, voice pitching higher. All right? She dissolved into ragged, unhinged laughter. Nothing is ever going to be all right. All the tension, the trauma, and visceral terror boiled over at once. She thrashed against me, howling, sobbing, incoherent with hysteria. I held her awkwardly, made soothing sounds, until her spasms subsided into exhausted stillness. She lay slackly, eyes staring through me. They're out there, she whispered, in the woods, waiting, always waiting. After that, she spoke no more. Not on the long trudge out of the ravine. Not when I flagged down a logging truck and begged the use of a satellite phone. Not when the EMTs loaded her onto a stretcher, vacant gaze fixed on horrors only she could see. In the weeks that followed, I underwent my own hell. The disbelief of my superiors, the ridicule of the official investigation team, who found no trace of the mining camp or the Wendigo's grisly shrine. The way my colleagues' eyes slid askance when I entered a room, marking me as unstable, unfit. Worst were the night terrors. I would jolt awake, sheets drenched in icy sweat, the echo of predatory howls still ringing in my ears. Flashbacks ambushed me at odd moments. A mall Santa's white beard and red suit suddenly transposed into a Wendigo's flayed skull and bloody pelt. They never found the other campers' remains. Just a few scraps of tent fabric, some scattered belongings. The official line was a bear attack. The bodies dragged off and scavenged. I knew better. Knew they had been harvested, transformed into gory trophies for the monster's amusement. So I sit here now and chronicle this, my final testament. Because the truth must be told, even if none believe it. Especially if none believe it. Someone must stand witness to the depravity that lurks in the primordial corners of our world, to the horrors that stalk the borderlands between myth and reality. I've lost my job, my reputation, maybe my sanity. Small prices to pay, in the grand scheme. The survivors, if you can call them that, will never recover. Their families grieve without closure, and something wicked still slouches through the deep woods, red eyes aglow and belly never full. As for me, I'll be heading back up that mountain soon. One man, one rifle, a fool's crusade most likely. But I can't just walk away, can't unknow the things I've seen. If I don't return, let this be my epitaph. I tried to stand against the dark, tried to protect the unwary from the hungry shadows. In the lonely nights to come, if you hear a keening wail from the wilderness, bar your door, say a prayer. And don't look too long into the forest, because it looks back. The crisp mountain air filled my lungs as I stepped out of my car, stretching my legs after the long drive. The trailhead parking lot was empty, save for my weathered Subaru Outback. I shouldered my heavy backpack, adjusting the straps until it sat comfortably. This solo camping trip had been long overdue, a chance to disconnect from the world and reconnect with nature. As I started down the pine needle-strewn path, the dense forest enveloped me. Towering pines and ancient oaks reached toward the sky, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the late afternoon sunlight. The trail wound its way deeper into the wilderness of the Navajo Nation, a place steeped in history and mystery. I'd always been drawn to these lands, fascinated by the rich tapestry of Native American lore. But it wasn't until I stumbled upon the legend of the Skinwalker that my curiosity truly ignited. These shape-shifting beings, said to be evil witches or medicine men who had gained the ability to turn into animals, had captured my imagination. Despite the warnings from my Navajo friend Tom about the dangers of seeking out such entities, I couldn't resist the allure of possibly encountering one. As I hiked, the only sounds were the crunching of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional call of a bird. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail, an eerie stillness settled over the forest. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees with an almost whisper-like quality. I shook off the growing unease, chalking it up to an overactive imagination fueled by too many late nights researching Skinwalker lore. After a couple of hours of hiking, I found a suitable clearing to set up camp. As I worked on pitching my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My eyes kept darting to the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, but each time, I saw nothing but shadows and swaying branches. With my tent secure and a small fire crackling, I settled in for the night. The flames cast flickering shadows across the clearing, and I found myself staring into the darkness beyond, straining to see what might be lurking just out of sight. I pulled out my journal, jotting down my thoughts and observations from the day's hike. As I wrote, a twig snapped in the distance. My head jerked up, pen hovering above the page. Silence followed, broken only by the pop and hiss of the fire. Then, carried on the wind, I heard it, a low guttural sound that was neither human nor animal. My blood ran cold as I remembered Tom's words. The Skinwalkers. They mimic sounds to lure you in, never follow a voice in the dark. I zipped up my tent, heart pounding in my chest. Sleep eluded me that night as I lay awake, listening to the forest. The wind continued to whisper through the trees, and occasionally, I could swear I heard my name being called from the darkness. But I stayed put, remembering the warnings, and prayed for the sun to rise quickly. Little did I know this was only the beginning of a terrifying journey that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world and the thin veil between reality and the supernatural. Dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. I emerged from my tent, bleary-eyed and exhausted from a restless night. The forest seemed peaceful in the early morning light, a stark contrast to the eerie atmosphere of the previous evening. I tried to convince myself that the strange sounds I'd heard were just tricks of the wind, or perhaps a coyote in the distance. As I prepared a simple breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to me like morning dew. I decided to explore the area around my campsite, hoping to ease my nerves and perhaps find a logical explanation for the night's events. With a steaming mug of coffee in hand, I began to circle the perimeter of the clearing. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. Tracks in the mud, just beyond where the light of my campfire would have reached. I crouched down to examine them more closely. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. At first glance, they resembled large canine prints, but upon closer inspection, I noticed something unsettling. The shape was slightly off, as if a human hand had been pressed into the dirt, but elongated and distorted. I felt a chill run down my spine as I remembered stories of skinwalkers taking the form of wolves or coyotes, but never quite getting the shape right. I took out my phone to snap a picture, but to my frustration, I found it completely drained of battery. Strange, I thought, as I distinctly remembered charging it fully before leaving on this trip. I made a mental note to document the tracks in my journal later. As I continued to follow the trail of prints, I noticed they seemed to circle my entire campsite before veering off into the dense underbrush. The implications of this discovery were unsettling. Something had been watching me, stalking the perimeter of my camp while I slept. I debated whether to pack up and head back to civilization, but my curiosity outweighed my fear. I had come here seeking answers about the Skinwalker legend, and now I might be on the verge of uncovering something extraordinary. Besides, I reasoned, if something had wanted to harm me, it had ample opportunity during the night. I decided to continue with my original hiking plan, but with a heightened sense of awareness. After breaking camp, I shouldered my pack and set off deeper into the wilderness. The trail gradually became steeper, winding its way up into the mountains. As I hiked, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. Every rustle in the bushes, every snapping twig sent my heart racing. I tried to focus on the beauty of my surroundings. The vibrant wildflowers dotting the mountainside, the majestic eagles soaring overhead, but my mind kept returning to those strange tracks and the eerie sounds from the night before. By midday, I reached a breathtaking vista overlooking a vast canyon. I paused to catch my breath and have a quick lunch. As I sat on a sun-warmed rock, munching on a granola bar, I noticed something odd in the distance. On the opposite ridge, barely visible, was what appeared to be a figure. It was too far away to make out clearly, but something about its proportions seemed off. It stood unnaturally still, and I could have sworn it was looking directly at me. I blinked, and in that instant it vanished. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if the sun and fatigue were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. As I packed up to continue my journey, a sudden gust of wind nearly knocked me off balance. Carried on that wind was a whisper, so faint I almost missed it. "Turn back." I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The voice had sounded almost familiar, like a distorted version of my own. Was this a warning, or a trick to lure me off course? With shaking hands, I pulled out my compass to confirm my bearings. To my horror, the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle on any direction. I was lost, in more ways than one, and the sun was already beginning its descent towards the horizon. As darkness approached, I knew I needed to find shelter fast. But with each step forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking further into the domain of something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting for me, perhaps for centuries. As twilight descended, I stumbled upon a small cave entrance, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. Despite my reservations about entering unknown caves, the rapidly darkening sky and dropping temperature left me with little choice. I switched on my headlamp and cautiously made my way inside. The cave was surprisingly deep, its walls adorned with faded petroglyphs. As I ventured further, the air grew thick with an odd musky scent. My headlamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the rock faces. I couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes in the ancient drawings were following my every move. Deeper in the cave, I discovered a small chamber that seemed suitable for spending the night. As I set up my sleeping bag, my light fell upon a peculiar arrangement of bones in the corner. They appeared to be ritualistic in nature, forming a pattern I didn't recognize. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I might be trespassing in a sacred or forbidden place. Sleep came fitfully that night. My dreams were plagued by visions of twisted creatures, half human and half beast, chasing me through endless dark forests. I woke several times, sweating and disoriented, only to be greeted by the impenetrable darkness of the cave. In the early hours of the morning, I was startled awake by a sound, rhythmic chanting echoing through the cave. It seemed to be coming from deeper within the mountain. Heart pounding, I packed up my gear as quietly as possible. As the chanting grew louder, I made my way towards the cave entrance, praying I wouldn't encounter whoever, or whatever, was producing those otherworldly sounds. Dawn was breaking as I emerged from the cave, casting an ethereal glow over the landscape. I set off immediately, eager to put distance between myself and the unsettling events of the night. As I hiked, the forest around me seemed different, darker, more primordial. The trees appeared to twist and reach towards me, their branches like gnarled fingers trying to impede my progress. Midday found me in a small clearing where I paused to rest and consult my still malfunctioning compass. As I sat on a fallen log, movement at the edge of the clearing caught my eye. An elderly Native American man emerged from the trees, his weathered face etched with lines of wisdom and concern. He introduced himself as Joseph, a Navajo shaman. His eyes bored into mine as he spoke. "You shouldn't be here, outsider. You've stirred something ancient and dangerous." I explained my research into skinwalker lore and my desire to uncover the truth. Joseph's expression darkened. "Some truths are not meant for the uninitiated. The skinwalkers are real, but they are not what you think. They are a perversion of sacred knowledge, a curse born of greed and vengeance." He went on to explain that my presence and curiosity had attracted the attention of a particularly malevolent skinwalker. "It hunts you now," he warned, "and it will not stop until it has your essence." Joseph provided me with a small leather pouch filled with herbs and insisted I wear it around my neck for protection. As he turned to leave, he paused and fixed me with a grave stare. "Head east, towards the rising sun. Do not look back. Do not respond to any voices you hear. Your only hope is to reach the boundaries of their territory before nightfall." With those ominous words, he melted back into the forest, leaving me alone with my fear and a desperate plan for survival. I set off eastward immediately, my pace quickening with every step. The forest seemed to grow denser, the underbrush more tangled, as if nature itself was trying to slow my progress. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf sent jolts of adrenaline through my system. As the afternoon wore on, I began to hear things, whispers on the wind, calling my name in voices that sounded disturbingly like those of my friends and family. I gritted my teeth and pressed on, remembering Joseph's warning. The sun was low on the horizon when I heard it, a bone-chilling howl that was neither wolf nor coyote. It was followed by the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush behind me. Terror lent wings to my feet as I broke into a run. I sprinted through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. The sounds of pursuit grew closer. Just as I felt claws about to close on my back, I burst out of the tree line into a wide meadow bathed in the last light of the setting sun. For a moment, all was silent. Then, at the edge of the forest, I saw it. The creature was horrifying, a twisted amalgamation of human and animal features, its body rippling as if struggling to maintain its form. Its eyes, glowing with an unholy light, were fixed upon me with predatory intent. As darkness fell, the chase resumed with renewed intensity. The meadow gave way to rocky terrain as I fled up the mountainside. The skinwalker was always just behind me, its inhuman shrieks echoing off the cliffs. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled, fueled by pure survival instinct. In the darkness, I lost my footing and tumbled down a steep incline. I landed hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. As I lay there dazed and gasping, I heard the creature's heavy breathing drawing nearer. In desperation, I clutched the charm Joseph had given me and began to recite a prayer I'd learned during my research, a plea for protection against dark forces. To my amazement, the approaching footsteps faltered. Taking advantage of this momentary reprieve, I scrambled to my feet and continued my flight. Throughout the night, this pattern repeated, frantic running, followed by moments of terror where the creature nearly had me, only to be held at bay by desperate prayers and the shaman's charm. As I ran, I began to hallucinate. The rocks and trees seemed to come alive, reaching out to grab me. Voices called out, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening, but I remembered Joseph's words and ignored them all, focusing only on putting one foot in front of the other. The first rays of dawn found me stumbling, exhausted and battered, down the far side of the mountain. The attacks had grown less frequent as the night wore on, and now an eerie silence had fallen. As the sun crested the horizon, I allowed myself a moment of hope. Had I escaped? Had I crossed some invisible boundary as Joseph suggested? My relief was short-lived. A blood-curdling screech split the air, and I turned to see the skinwalker crouched on a boulder above me. In the light of day, its appearance was even more terrifying, a nightmarish blend of human, wolf, and something utterly alien. It launched itself towards me, claws extended. In that moment, time seemed to slow. I saw my life flash before my eyes, regret for my foolish curiosity washing over me. But then, miraculously, the creature pulled up short. It writhed in apparent agony, its form blurring and shifting rapidly. I realized we were standing in the direct light of the rising sun. With a final hate-filled glare, the skinwalker retreated, melting into the shadows of a nearby crevice. I wasted no time in putting distance between us, half running, half stumbling down the mountain path. I emerged from the wilderness later that day, my clothes torn, my body bruised, and my mind forever changed. The first person I encountered was a park ranger, who was shocked by my appearance and immediately called for medical assistance. As I recovered in the hospital, I struggled to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as a stress-induced hallucination brought on by isolation and exhaustion. But the leather pouch around my neck and the vivid memories of terror were undeniable proof of my ordeal. I discovered that I had been in the wilderness for 5 days, though it had felt like an eternity. My disappearance had prompted a search, but no trace of me had been found. The authorities were baffled by my story, and I quickly learned to keep the full truth to myself, sharing only that I had gotten lost and injured. In the months that followed, I pored over my research notes, cross-referencing my experience with ancient legends and modern accounts. I came to understand that I had glimpsed a world hidden beneath the surface of our reality, a world of primal forces and ancient magics that defied rational explanation. I never returned to those mountains, but the experience haunted me, sometimes on dark nights when the wind howls. I imagine I hear distant, inhuman cries. And in my dreams, I still run from shadows that twist and change, always pursuing, never tiring. My ordeal taught me a valuable lesson about the dangers of seeking knowledge not meant for mortal minds. There are secrets in this world that should remain hidden, forces that should not be disturbed, and in the remote wilderness, where the veil between worlds grows thin, one might just encounter horrors beyond imagination. As I sit here penning this account, I can't shake the feeling that my story is not yet over. The skinwalker is still out there, waiting, and deep down, I fear that one day it will find me again. My name is Harold Carter, and I am 74 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on July 22nd. It was my third year working as a park ranger in Yellowstone National Park, and it changed my life forever. I love everything about being a park ranger. The towering trees that have stood sentinel for centuries, the diverse wildlife that roams freely through the vast wilderness, and those geysers that never fail to impress. It's my kind of paradise. Yellowstone has a raw, untamed beauty that never ceases to take my breath away. I spend a lot of time alone out here. Don't get me wrong. I see tourists all the time. It's talking with my fellow rangers that's scarce. But I don't mind. Solitude suits me, allowing me to immerse myself in the natural world around me. The whisper of wind through the pines, the distant call of an elk, the bubbling of hot springs. These are the sounds that fill my days. Sometimes, though, I wish I had company out in the thick of the trails. The vastness of Yellowstone can be overwhelming, and there are moments when the isolation weighs heavily on me. Little did I know that on that fateful day in July, I would come to cherish those moments of solitude. The day this all started, I set out early. The air was crisp with the lingering chill of the night, but I knew it would warm up quickly. There had been reports of downed trees blocking one of the more popular hiking trails, and it was my job to clear the way. It was routine work, the kind that fills most of my days. I grabbed my gear, axe, saw, water bottles, and a packed lunch, and headed into the woods. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds greeting the morning sun, and shafts of golden light pierced through the canopy, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. I found the first fallen tree a little past noon. A big old pine had come right down across the path, its massive trunk creating an impassable barrier for hikers. I set my pack down and got to work, the rhythmic sound of my saw cutting through the quiet of the forest. It was hot and sweaty work despite the shade, so I took frequent water breaks. The physical labor was demanding, but there was something satisfying about it. With each cut, I was helping to maintain the trails that allowed others to experience the beauty of Yellowstone. As I worked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. The scent of fresh-cut pine filled the air, mingling with the earthy smell of the forest. A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, providing momentary relief from the heat. I paused for a moment, wiping sweat from my brow, and took in the scenery around me. The towering trees, the patches of wildflowers, the distant call of a woodpecker. It was moments like these that reminded me why I loved my job so much. Little did I know that this sense of peace was about to be shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. The scream cut through the air like a knife, instantly chilling my blood. It was a woman's voice, high-pitched and choked with terror. The sound seemed to come from deeper in the trees, not too far from where I was working. I dropped my saw, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. Adrenaline surged through my body, making my vision tunnel. "Hello," I yelled, my voice echoing through the trees. "Can you hear me?" There was no answer, just an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Then another scream pierced the air, louder this time, and unmistakably closer. I took off running, pushing through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face as I ran. "I'm coming," I shouted, hoping my voice would provide some comfort to whoever was in distress. "Hold on." I burst through a thick patch of bushes, and suddenly there she was, a young woman, probably in her mid-20s, with blonde hair matted with leaves and dirt. She was collapsed against a large boulder, her body shaking with sobs. As I approached, I saw that her hands were covered in blood. "Hey," I said, dropping to my knees beside her. "Are you all right? What happened?" She didn't speak, just pointed shakily further down the path. Her hands were trembling, covered in red, and I realized with a jolt that it wasn't her own blood. Following the direction of her frantic gestures, my stomach dropped. There, lying face down in the dirt about 20 feet away, was a body. "Stay here," I told the woman, my voice sounding surprisingly calm despite the panic rising in my chest. I approached the body cautiously, my eyes darting around the surrounding forest. Whatever had done this could still be nearby. The man, I could see now it was a man, was wearing a backpack with a bright green sleeping bag strapped to it. Probably a hiker, like so many others who came to explore Yellowstone's beauty. Now he lay motionless in the dirt, his body unnaturally still. "Sir," I called out, clinging to a desperate hope. "Are you all right?" Silence was my only answer. I knelt beside him, my hand shaking as I reached out to check for a pulse. I gently rolled him over, and that's when I wished I hadn't. The man's chest was, there's no word for it. Torn open is the closest I can get, but it doesn't begin to describe the horror of what I saw. It was as if something huge had clawed at him, ripping out his insides with savage fury. There was blood everywhere, and bits of him I couldn't even identify. The forest floor was a canvas of gore, painted in shades of red I never knew existed. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear attack? There had been a few sightings recently, but even as the thought formed, I knew this was something different. Something worse. Rising to my feet, my brain worked at full speed. The woman was clearly in shock. I had to get her out of here, and I needed to call for help. But how? My radio was back with my gear near the felled trees. Do I leave the woman to get it? What if whatever did this comes back? I was frozen with indecision when I heard it. A crunching sound of twigs and leaves from the woods behind us. I whipped around, my heart in my throat, expecting to see a bear. But what I saw instead would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. The creature that emerged from the shadows of the forest was tall, too tall to be human, and it moved all wrong. It stood on two legs, yes, but it was hunched over, its posture a mockery of human stance. Its arms were impossibly long, dragging on the ground like some primordial ape. But it wasn't an ape. It wasn't anything that belonged in this world. The thing was covered in what at first glance looked like dark fur. But as it moved closer, I realized with growing horror that it was matted hair. Long, tangled, and matted with what looked horribly like dried blood. The creature tilted its head as if curious, and I found myself staring into its face. Its eyes were small and deep-set in a face that was both human and not. The jaw was too wide, stretching across its face in a grotesque parody of a smile, filled with long, yellowing teeth. It snarled silently, and that's when I saw the blood on its hands. Not hands, claws. Long, curved, and wickedly sharp, still dripping with fresh blood. The woman behind me let out another scream, this one filled with pure, unadulterated terror. It broke the spell of horror that had frozen me in place. "Run," I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. "Run now." The creature lunged forward with frightening speed, but I was already moving. I bolted back the way I came, crashing through the underbrush with reckless abandon. It was a desperate sprint, fueled by pure survival instinct. I could hear the woman's cries behind me, interspersed with those horrible snarls that seemed to grow closer with each passing second. My breath burned in my lungs, and my legs threatened to give out, but I pushed on. Adrenaline gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging cuts, but I barely felt them. My entire world had narrowed down to this, run or die. I burst into the clearing where I had left my tools, and I saw them, my radio and my axe. In that split second, I had to make a choice. I snatched up the axe just as the creature burst from the tree line. For a wild moment I considered facing it, protecting the woman I'd now dragged into this nightmare. But it was a ridiculous notion. This thing wasn't an animal. It was something twisted, something wrong. And I wasn't a hero. "Run towards the park entrance," I yelled at the woman, hoping she could hear me over the pounding of my own heart. Grabbing my radio, I followed my own advice and ran. My legs pumped furiously, my breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I fumbled with the radio as I ran, calling desperately for backup. My voice was panicked, barely coherent as I gave the ranger station the bare essentials of our location. Then the voice of Janice, the dispatcher, came through, telling me help was on the way, to hang tight. But hanging tight was the one thing I couldn't do. I could hear the snarls behind me, closer with each passing second. Janice's voice crackled over the radio again, telling me helicopters and a team of rangers were inbound. They were minutes away, but minutes might as well have been years. The creature would be on me long before then. I pushed myself harder, my lungs threatening to burst, my limbs on fire. Then I heard it, the woman's scream behind me, piercing and desperate. Then it cut off abruptly. A terrible silence fell over the forest. Dread settled in the pit of my stomach. Tears of frustration stung my eyes as I ran faster, branches whipping my face. I had to make it. I couldn't let that thing catch me. The trees began to thin out ahead. I could see a break in the foliage, an opening, and that's when I spotted it, the old fire watchtower. The fire watchtower loomed ahead, a rusted relic from a bygone era. It wasn't much, but it was my only hope. I scrambled towards it, my legs burning with the effort. I reached the base of the tower and grabbed the rusted ladder, cursing my trembling hands as I began to climb. The metal rungs were slick with moisture, making each step a potential disaster. But fear gave me strength, and I hauled myself up with desperate energy. The platform was only 20 feet up. Not much of a defense, but it was better than being on the ground. Gasping for air, I collapsed onto the wooden planks, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. After a moment, I risked a look back. The creature was there at the base of the tower, staring up at me with those terrible eyes. It snarled and pawed at the metal rungs, but it couldn't seem to figure out how to climb. The throbbing in my legs began to lessen. The pounding in my head started to subside. I clung to the railing for dear life, my knuckles white with the effort. That's when I heard it. The most glorious sound I've ever known. Helicopters. The sound of rotor blades filled the air, growing louder by the second. 3 helicopters appeared over the tree line, their powerful spotlights piercing the dimming forest. My adrenaline spiked again, not in fear this time, but in the hope of rescue. I waved my arms frantically, trying to catch their attention. One of the helicopters descended, stirring up leaves and dust with its powerful blades. Below, I saw rangers spill out of the chopper. Men and women I knew, some of them trained with firearms. They moved in a tactical formation, rifles raised, shouting for me to stay put. But my eyes were drawn to the trees. The creature had vanished back into the shadows as if it had never been there. It felt like a lifetime before they managed to get me down from the tower. They lowered a harness, and I fumbled with the straps, my hands still shaking from the ordeal. When my feet finally touched solid ground, my legs turned to jelly, and I nearly collapsed. 2 rangers flanked me, their guns pointed outwards as we made our way back into the woods. We found the man's body first, the gruesome scene just as I had left it. Then we found the woman, or what was left of her. The aftermath was horrific, far worse than the initial sight of the man's corpse. I can't, put the details into words. The rangers were hard men, weathered by the things they'd seen out here, but they blanched at the sight. One of them turned aside to vomit. There was no sign of the creature. It had vanished like a ghost, though the evidence of its inhuman brutality was sickeningly real. The rangers collected what was left of the woman's body, solemnly bagging the pieces. The man, at least, was easier to recover. I was spared none of this, the ordeal not ending even with my rescue. That night, I found myself back at the ranger station, giving my statement. It was a blur of well-meaning faces, offers of coffee and blankets, concerned questions. I answered mechanically, still trapped inside my own head, replaying the day's events, the screams, the chase, and the sight of those things the monster had left behind. Janice, the dispatcher whose voice had been a lifeline during my escape, pulled me aside. Her face was etched with concern, her eyes searching mine as if looking for something she hoped not to find. "I know you're in shock, Harold," she said gently, "but we need to talk about what you saw back there. That thing." The word hung in the air, heavy and ugly. I described it as best I could. The hunched posture, the matted hair, the too wide jaw, and those damn eyes. Deep set and gleaming in the dark like an animal, yet with a chilling intelligence behind them. Janice listened, her face growing paler with each detail. They searched the woods the next day, and the day after that. No sign of the creature, not a footprint, not a strand of hair. The park was shut down, tourists turned away, a whole section of Yellowstone was cordoned off. They even brought in search dogs, but the creature was gone, swallowed up by the wilderness, as if it had never been there. The aftermath. Well, let's just say it's been hell. Reporters swarmed like vultures. Local ones at first. Then national as the story made headlines. Beast of Yellowstone, they called it, stirring up a frenzy. Conspiracy theorists popped up, raving about aliens or government experiments gone wrong. Some even accused me, saying I'd made it all up. Or worse, that I was the monster. I was put on leave, of course. Mandatory counseling sessions, psych evaluations, the whole 9 yards. They asked the same questions over and over. Could it have been a bear? Did I see it clearly? Was it possible I'd imagined the whole thing? Maybe it was the shock, the trauma playing tricks on my mind. They kept searching the woods, finding nothing, and I could see the doubt lingering in their eyes. The worst part was, I began to doubt myself too. There were no witnesses, no evidence of the thing except for what it did to those poor people. The nights became a waking nightmare. I'd see the creature's face every time I closed my eyes. Those gleaming eyes and yellow teeth, the blood on its claws. I'd see the woman, what was left of her, and hear her screams echoing in my head. Months passed, and the furor died down a little. There were no new attacks, no sightings of the creature. Life in the little tourist town near the park started to return to normal, but it wasn't normal for me. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched, that the thing was still out there waiting. I started checking over my shoulder every 2 minutes, jumping at any odd sound. The trees that once felt like home now seemed menacing, every shadow a potential hiding place for the monster. My fellow rangers tried to be supportive, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They'd smile and nod when I talked about the creature, but their expressions were those of people humoring someone they thought might be losing their grip on reality. It was isolating, to say the least. A year after the incident, I quit the Park Service. I couldn't bear the sight of the forest anymore. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent my heart racing. The wilderness I once loved had become a source of constant terror. I moved away, trying to rebuild a life somewhere the woods weren't looming over me. I found a small apartment in a bustling city surrounded by concrete and steel instead of trees and mountains. Some days I almost succeeded in convincing myself that what happened in Yellowstone was just a terrible nightmare. I told myself it was a rogue bear attack, a freak accident amplified by trauma and fear. I forced myself to forget the creature's too human face, the calculating malevolence in its eyes. But then there were the reports. It started with whispers, rumors on the internet that I tried my best to ignore. But soon the stories were impossible to overlook. Not in Yellowstone. No. The attacks were happening hundreds of miles away, deep in other national forests. Missing hikers, bodies torn apart, all bearing the same gruesome signature I had witnessed that day in Yellowstone. People whispered the same name, the Beast. They didn't know the details. How could they? But I knew. It was out there, still hunting. The news stories fueled my nightmares. I started carrying a gun, learned how to use it properly. Some nights I'd leave my blinds open, watching the shadows shift in the streetlights below, just in case. The city that had once felt like a safe haven now seemed like a fragile illusion of security. I tried reaching out to my old colleagues at Yellowstone, but the response was always the same. Polite dismissals, gentle suggestions that maybe I should talk to someone about what I'd been through. They didn't want to hear about the new attacks, didn't want to consider that what had happened that day might be part of something larger and more terrifying. The other rangers, well, we didn't talk about it. Not directly, but sometimes at reunions, I'd catch them watching me. Their eyes filled with pity or something worse, like they thought I'd broken, that I was one step away from snapping, hunting a monster that may only exist inside my head. And maybe they were right. Maybe the trauma had warped my mind, made me see connections where there were none. But deep down, I knew the truth. The beast was real, and it was still out there. It's been nearly 3 decades since that day in Yellowstone, and I'm an old man now. The world has moved on, forgotten about the Beast of Yellowstone incident. It's become nothing more than a local legend, a story to scare tourists around campfires. But I haven't forgotten. I can't forget. I've spent years researching, gathering every scrap of information I could find about similar attacks. I've plotted them on maps, looking for patterns, trying to understand the creature's movements. And slowly, a picture has emerged. It's not just one beast. There are more of them out there. hidden in the wild places of the world. They're smart, they're careful, and they're patient. They strike rarely, but when they do, it's with terrifying brutality. I've tried to warn people, to get the authorities to take it seriously. But who's going to listen to an old man rambling about monsters in the woods? I'm just another crackpot, another conspiracy theorist to be ignored or pitied. But I know the truth. And that's why I'm writing this now, putting my story down in the hope that someday someone will believe. Someone will understand the danger that's out there, lurking in the shadows of our wilderness. To whoever reads this, be careful out there. The woods are beautiful, but they hide secrets. Dark, terrible secrets. And sometimes those secrets have teeth and claws. My name is Harold Carter. I'm 74 years old, and this is my warning to the world. It was late August of 1987 when I found myself driving through the back roads of northern Minnesota. The sun was sinking low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that filtered through the dense canopy of pine and birch trees. I'd been working as a seasonal ranger for the Chippewa National Forest for nearly 6 years by then, and the winding dirt roads felt as familiar to me as the lines on my own palm. My name is Michael Birdwing, and I've spent most of my life in these woods. Growing up on the White Earth Reservation had taught me to appreciate solitude and the outdoors, so being out here suited me just fine. My friends always joked that I was more comfortable with trees than people, and I couldn't really argue with that. As I navigated the old Ford pickup through a particularly rough stretch of road, my mind wandered back to my childhood. I remembered my grandfather, a respected elder in our community, teaching me about the spirits of the forest. "The woods are alive, Michael," he'd say, his weathered hands gesturing to the trees around us. "They have stories to tell, if you know how to listen." Back then, I thought he was just trying to scare me into respecting nature. Now, after years in the Forest Service, I wasn't so sure. The radio crackled to life, startling me out of my reverie. "Ranger Birdwing, come in, over." I recognized the voice of Diane, our dispatch operator. I picked up the handset. "This is Birdwing. Go ahead, Diane. Just checking in on your status. You heading up to the old fire lookout near Itasca?" "Affirmative," I replied, squinting as the fading sunlight hit my eyes at just the wrong angle. "Should be there in about an hour, maybe less if this road cooperates." "Copy that. Remember, we've had those reports of missing campers in the area. Keep your eyes peeled for anything unusual." I felt a slight chill run down my spine at her words. The missing campers. 3 in the past month, if I remembered correctly. It wasn't unheard of for hikers to get lost in these parts, but 3 in such a short time was unusual. "Will do, Diane. I'll radio in when I reach the tower. Birdwing out." As I replaced the handset, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. The forest seemed different somehow, more watchful. I shook my head, trying to clear away the ridiculous notion. Forests don't watch, they just are. The sky had been clear when I started my journey, but as I drove deeper into the wilderness, thick clouds began to roll in, casting a gray shadow over the tree line. The narrow dirt road felt more like a game trail now, flanked by towering pines that seemed to lean in, swallowing up what little remained of the evening light. I knew this road well, having patrolled this stretch countless times, but something about the air felt heavier than usual. It had rained recently, and the smell of damp earth was thick, mingling with the pine needles and the faint scent of decay that always accompanied the turning of the seasons. As I rounded a bend, a flash of movement caught my eye. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the damp ground. For a moment I could have sworn I saw something. A dark shape too big to be a deer, too fast to be a bear. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, leaving me staring at nothing but shadows and trees. My heart was pounding, and I realized I had been holding my breath. I let it out slowly, trying to calm my nerves. "Get it together, Michael," I muttered to myself. "You're jumping at shadows now." But as I put the truck back in gear and continued on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there in the darkening forest was watching me, waiting. And for the first time in years, I found myself wishing I wasn't quite so alone out here in the wilderness. I parked the truck about a mile from the tower, not wanting to risk getting stuck in the mud. The rain had picked up, a light drizzle that seemed to hang in the air more than fall. Slinging my pack over my shoulder, I started up the trail, my boots squelching in the sodden earth. I hadn't gone more than 50 yards when I noticed something strange. Scattered along the path were several deer carcasses. At first, I thought they were victims of a poacher. But upon closer inspection, it didn't look right. The bodies hadn't been skinned or gutted, and their throats were torn out, but in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't clean like a knife wound, or even the result of a wolf attack. There was a gnawing sense of wrongness in the way the flesh was ripped open. The blood had dried into the dirt like it had happened hours ago, but the bodies were fresh, no signs of decay or scavenger activity. My grandfather's words echoed in my mind. The forest has its own hunters, Michael, some older than the trees themselves. I shook off the thought. This was no time for ghost stories. My instincts told me to turn back, but curiosity and duty kept me moving forward. What was I going to tell my supervisor? That I left because of a few dead deer? I kept walking, though I unholstered my sidearm, an old .5.7 Magnum that I'd kept since my rookie days. Its weight was reassuring in my hand, even as a voice in the back of my mind whispered that it might not be enough. As I got closer to the tower, I noticed the usual sounds of the forest were gone. No birds, no wind in the trees, not even the distant hum of crickets. The silence felt suffocating, broken only by the soft patter of rain and the sound of my own breathing. Then I saw it, barely 30 yards ahead. Something was crouched near the base of the fire tower, and it was feeding. My first thought was that it was a bear, maybe a wolf. But as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't like anything I had ever seen. It was huge, easily over 7 feet tall if it had stood upright, with hunched shoulders covered in matted fur. The way it moved was unsettling, like it wasn't built to move on all fours, but did so out of necessity. Its limbs were too long, the back legs too short, giving it a lopsided, almost unnatural gait. I could see its mouth working over something, probably the remains of one of the deer. Then it stopped. It raised its head, nostrils flaring, and turned toward me. I froze, heart pounding, hand gripping the gun tightly. The face. It wasn't right. It had the elongated snout of a wolf, but the jaw was too wide, and the teeth, they didn't fit together like they should. They jutted out at odd angles, jagged, more like the maw of a wild boar than any predator I knew. It let out a sound, a kind of huff that reminded me of a horse, but it was far more primal, a sound that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Without warning, it moved, fast. I barely had time to raise my weapon before it was on me, knocking me backward into the underbrush. I fired, but I wasn't sure if I hit it. All I knew was the weight of the thing, the smell of wet fur, and the feeling of sharp claws raking across my leg. I screamed, kicked and rolled, firing again, this time hearing a sickening thud as the bullet found its mark. It staggered, just enough for me to scramble back to my feet, adrenaline pumping through my veins. The thing swayed, blood oozing from its side, but it didn't go down. I kept my gun trained on it, not sure whether to shoot again or run. But before I could decide, it turned and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the thick underbrush with a speed that didn't seem possible for something its size. For a moment I stood there panting, bleeding, trying to wrap my head around what I had just seen. Then I realized something. It had dropped whatever it had been eating. I forced myself to walk over to the base of the tower, my leg throbbing with each step. Lying there, half hidden in the grass, was the body of a young man, no older than 20. His throat had been ripped out, the same way as the deer. He wasn't dressed like a hiker. In fact, his clothes looked more like they belonged to a college kid. Jeans, a faded hoodie, sneakers. The missing camper, no doubt. I radioed for backup, though I knew it would take them hours to reach me. "This is Ranger Birdwing," I said, my voice shaking more than I'd like to admit. "I'm at the old fire tower near Itasca. I've found one of the missing campers. And something else. Send everyone you've got." "Copy that, Ranger Birdwing." Diane's voice crackled back, concern evident in her tone. "Are you injured? What do you mean by something else?" I looked down at my leg, the denim of my jeans torn and stained with blood. "I'm hurt, but it's not bad. As for the other thing, you wouldn't believe me if I told you. Just send help, and tell them to come armed." I wasn't about to wait around for that thing to come back, so I made my way back to the truck as fast as my injured leg would allow. I kept my gun out, ears straining for any sound that might signal its return. The rain had picked up, washing away the blood on my leg and probably any tracks that thing had left. As I drove back down the muddy road, my mind raced. What was that creature? Some kind of mutant wolf? A bear with a deformity? Or something else entirely? Something that shouldn't exist in this world? I remembered the stories my grandfather used to tell. Tales of shapeshifters and forest spirits that could take on monstrous forms. As a kid, I dismissed them as just that, stories. Now I wasn't so sure. When the search team arrived, they found the body exactly where I said it would be. There was no sign of the creature, but I didn't care. The boy's body was there, along with the remains of the deer, and that was all the proof I needed that what I had encountered was real. The official report called it a wolf attack. They said it was rare but not unheard of in that area. They chalked up my description of the thing to shock and adrenaline, and I didn't argue. It was easier that way. But I knew what I had seen, and I wasn't the only one who believed. A few days after the incident, as I was recovering at home, I received a visit from an elder from the reservation. He listened to my story without interruption, his weathered face grave. When I finished, he nodded slowly. Our people have known of such creatures for generations, he said. The Wendigo, the Skinwalker, they have many names, but they are real, as real as you and me. You are lucky to have survived, Michael. He left me with a small leather pouch, filled with herbs and what looked like animal teeth. For protection, he said, though I hope you never need it again. I've been back in those woods many times since that night. I had to be. It's my job. But I've never seen that creature again. Sometimes, though, when the wind is right and the shadows are deep, I catch a scent on the air. Wet fur and decay. And I remember, if I had to guess, I'd say it was something none of us had ever seen before. Something older than the forest itself. Maybe it was just hungry. Maybe it was defending its territory. Either way, I'm not going back to find out. But I keep my eyes open and my gun close, because I know now that the forests hide more than just trees and animals. There are older things out there, watching and waiting. And sometimes, they hunt. The years following my encounter in the woods near Itasca were marked by a constant struggle between my desire to forget and my need to understand. I continued my work as a forest ranger. But something had changed. The woods that had once been my sanctuary now held shadows I couldn't ignore. For months after the incident, I threw myself into research. I pored over old tribal records, spoke with elders from various Native American communities, and even reached out to cryptozoologists and folklore experts. Most dismissed my story as the product of stress and an overactive imagination, but a few listened, and what they shared with me only deepened the mystery. I learned of similar sightings across North America, stretching back centuries. Creatures that walked the line between animal and something else, always tied to disappearances and unexplained deaths. The Algonquin spoke of the Wendigo, a creature born of human greed and hunger. The Navajo had tales of skinwalkers, shamans who could take on animal form, and in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, stories of Sasquatch took on a darker tone when compared to what I had seen. But concrete evidence remained elusive. The official investigation into the camper deaths concluded with a statement about increased wolf activity in the area. The carcasses I had found were attributed to a particularly aggressive pack. My own injuries were recorded as the result of a fall during the investigation. I knew better, but I also knew the danger of pushing too hard against the official narrative. So I kept my head down and did my job, all the while keeping my eyes open for any sign that the creature might return. 5 years after the incident, I had almost convinced myself it had been a one-time event. Then the disappearances started again. This time it wasn't campers. 3 hunters went missing over the course of a month, all within a 10-mile radius of the old fire tower. I was part of the search team, and this time I was prepared. I carried not only my service weapon but also the protective charm the elder had given me years before. As we combed the woods, I felt a familiar unease settle over me. The forest was too quiet, the shadows too deep. We found 2 of the hunters, or what was left of them. The scene was eerily similar to what I had encountered years before. Bodies torn apart, with no signs of typical predator behavior. The 3rd hunter was never found. As I stood there staring at the grisly scene, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the clearing. For a split second I saw it. The same elongated snout, the misshapen body, the eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light. Our gazes locked, and in that moment, I knew 2 things with absolute certainty. First, this creature, whatever it was intelligent. It recognized me, just as I recognized it. And second, this was its territory. We were the intruders here. As quickly as it appeared, it vanished into the underbrush. I reported the sighting, but no one else had seen it. Once again, I was left with more questions than answers. In the years that followed, I rose through the ranks of the Forest Service. I used my position to implement stricter safety protocols for campers and hikers, and to quietly keep tabs on any unusual animal activity in the area. There were no more mass disappearances, but every few years, a lone hiker would vanish without a trace. Now, as I approach retirement, I find myself reflecting on that night in 1987, and all that came after. I've spent a career balancing my duty to protect the public, with my understanding that there are things in this world beyond our comprehension. I still venture into the woods, though not as often as I used to. And when I do, I carry with me not just my gear and my gun, but also the knowledge that the forest holds secrets older than humanity itself. Some nights, when the wind howls through the trees and the moon casts long shadows, I think I hear something moving out there, something that doesn't belong, and I wonder if it remembers me as clearly as I remember it. To those who come after me, who patrol these woods and look after those who visit them, I leave this warning. Respect the forest and all it contains. But never forget that not everything that walks on four legs is an animal, and not every shadow is cast by the trees. The woods are alive, just as my grandfather said. They have stories to tell, but some of those stories are better left untold, and some creatures are better left unwatched. For in the deepest parts of the forest, where the shadows are darkest and the silence is complete, something is always watching back. My name is James Walker. This is a true story of events that happened to me in September of 2012, when I was a ranger in Olympic National Park. I've been hesitant to share this account for years, but now, as I approach the twilight of my life, I feel compelled to put these experiences to paper. Perhaps it will serve as a warning, or maybe just a reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. I had been a ranger in Olympic National Park for a little over 5 years when it happened. The job was a perfect fit for me. I loved the rainforests, the remoteness, the feeling that I'd stepped into another world entirely. But there's remote, and then there's the deep-ho rainforest. Miles of old-growth trees dripping with moss. Thick underbrush that seems to swallow sound itself. The kind of place where sunlight barely filters through and getting lost is terrifyingly easy. In early September of 2012, I was assigned to trail maintenance in one of the most secluded areas of the park. It was a routine 2-day job meant to be tackled alone. Routine, at least by ranger standards. My first day on the job went about as smoothly as cutting back vines and overgrowth can get. By evening, I'd set up camp in a small clearing near the river, cooked myself a freeze-dried dinner, and settled down with my headlamp and a paperback to unwind before bed. That's when I heard it. It wasn't a bear, not a cougar, not the usual symphony of forest critters settling in for the night. It was something like a sob, choked and desperate, followed by a scuffling sound in the undergrowth. Now protocol is clear when it comes to civilians in trouble. That's when you intervene. But rangers out in the backcountry, you tread lightly, respect the wilderness for what it is. Still, there was something about that sound that set my teeth on edge. I grabbed my rifle, clicked off the safety, and headed in the direction of the noise. The ferns and fallen leaves muffled my footsteps, making the forest seem even quieter after the strange cry. Every creaking branch had me on edge. Up ahead, something thrashed in a thicket of thorny vines. "Hello? Anyone there?" I called out, my voice hoarse in the quiet. No answer came, just an odd rustling sound followed by a flash of movement deeper in the darkness. I took a cautious step forward, my finger resting lightly on the trigger of my rifle. And that's when the thing pounced. It knocked me clean off my feet, a blur of sinewy limbs and foul-smelling fur. I hit the wet ground with a grunt, my rifle skidding away into the underbrush. I got a glimpse of clawed hands, too long for a bear, and rows of teeth, pointed and yellow. But all I really remember are the eyes, big amber and burning with a hate that felt, well, not just animal. It let out a blood-curdling screech and lunged for my throat. I rolled away, fumbling desperately in the damp leaves for my rifle. I found it, twisted as much as I dared with the thing so close, and took a shot, more out of instinct than anything else. The thing recoiled with a howl, a spray of blood marking the tree behind it, but it wasn't down. It circled me, panting heavily, its eyes locked on me like prey. That's when I saw it clearly. Too skinny to be a bear, yet strong enough to have taken a grown man down. Skin stretched over prominent ribs, patchy in places, and mottled a sickly brown. The head was almost dog-like, but elongated and filled with far too many teeth. It stalked me like a predator, but there was more there, an intelligence that set my teeth on edge. I fired again. It flinched, then scrambled further into the undergrowth, vanishing in seconds amidst the shadows of the trees. Shaking, I got to my feet, my heart pounding like a war drum. I had to get out of there. Radioing in to report the incident was met with predictable skepticism. It took 3 days, a team of rangers armed to the teeth, and an awful lot of blood splatter on the forest floor before they believed what I saw out there. They never found the creature. Said it must have been a sick bear, or maybe a coyote with mange playing mind games with me. I transferred shortly after that, took a desk job up in Seattle. I haven't even liked going on hikes lately, the trees closing in too tight. But every now and then at night, when the city noise subsides, I swear I hear that screech again, and then I see those eyes, glowing in the darkness just beyond my window. It's been over a decade since that night in Olympic National Park, but the memory hasn't faded. If anything, it's grown sharper, more insistent. I've tried to rationalize it, to explain it away as the product of fear and isolation. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. I'm not the only one with a story like this. Over the years, I've heard whispers, fragments of similar encounters from other rangers, hikers, and backwoods folk. They don't talk about it openly. Who would believe them? But in quiet corners of bars, around dying campfires, the stories come out. There was Elias Harper, a ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains. His story reached me through the grapevine, passed along by a mutual friend who knew we'd both seen something. Elias's encounter happened in October of 2016, 4 years after mine. The details were different, but the core of it, the otherworldly menace, the primal fear, that was the same. Elias told it like this. I'm a national park ranger working in the Great Smoky Mountains. Love the views up here, but man, these woods go on forever, and half the time you can't see 10 feet through the fog. Perfect recipe for folks getting themselves lost. Got the call about a missing hiker around dusk. Young guy, early 20s, on a solo trip. Last checked in at a ranger station further into the backcountry, and never made it to his planned campsite. Cell service out here is spotty at best, so it wasn't uncommon for people to go off-grid for stretches. But a storm was brewing, and rangers don't take chances. I suited up, headed out. The trail wound through thick forest, dripping with mist and shadowed by ancient trees. Rain began to fall, a cold, insistent drizzle. Found his discarded pack a few miles in. It was torn open, gear scattered like he dumped it in a panic. I knelt by a shredded energy bar wrapper, frown deepening. Didn't look like a bear attack. Bear scat's easy to spot, and they usually leave most of the inedible stuff undisturbed. What I did find were tracks, big ones. Too wide for a human, and the toes were splayed out strangely. A chill unrelated to the rain snaked down my spine. We get mountain lions up here, but something about the size and shape of these prints felt wrong. Followed those tracks deeper into the woods. The rain picked up, washing away any clearer trace, but I knew I was on the right path. Panic gnawed at my gut. If it was a big cat, the weather would flush it out into the open, same as the hiker. We were both in danger, only I had a radio and a rifle. The forest floor sloped downwards, leading towards a shadowy ravine. As I got closer, the smell hit me. Blood and wet fur mixing with that same rotten chemical stink that had been haunting my nightmares ever since. Well, that's a whole nother mess. But trust me, once you smell that, you don't ever forget it. The ravine snaked through the trees, and I moved silently along the high ground, tracking whatever had made those prints. Then ahead of me, movement. A flicker of something pale and unnaturally large hunkering beneath a jutting rock. I crouched lower, heart pounding against my ribs. That's when I saw it. Truly saw it. Not a mountain lion. This thing, it was humanoid, but only vaguely. Too tall, too lean, its skin hanging loose on a knobby frame. Its head was like a misshapen skull with yellow eyes that burned like embers in the gathering gloom. Claws, long as a man's fingers, dug into the carcass of what used to be the missing hiker. I fought back bile, raised my rifle with trembling hands. I was a decent shot, but this was beyond any training they give you at the academy. Had to make this first one count. Lined up the sights, took a deep, steadying breath. Then the damn flashlight flickered. Must have gotten knocked loose when I dropped my pack back at the campsite. The beam of light swung wildly, illuminating the creature for a horrifying second. It shrieked, a sound like metal scraping against stone, and reared back, shielding its eyes. It dropped the remains of the hiker and lunged toward me, moving with a speed that defied its skeletal frame. I fired once, twice, the rifle bucking hard against my shoulder. It flinched, roared, but it kept coming. I only had time to scramble back a few steps before it was on me. A force like a runaway truck slammed into my chest, sending me sprawling backward. I hit the earth hard, rifle flying from my grasp. The creature loomed above me, its fetid breath washing over my face. I fumbled for my backup pistol, fingers clumsy with fear and cold. It raised a clawed hand to strike. Somehow I managed to roll, the blow narrowly missing my skull but tearing open my shoulder. I scrambled back, scrabbling desperately for a weapon. Anything. The creature snarled, stalking forward. Pain seared through me, and my vision blurred around the edges. This was it. This was how it ended. A sudden beam of intense light cut through the forest gloom, so bright it made me flinch. The creature jerked back, hissing, the light stinging its eyes. Confused but desperate, I swung my own flashlight around. Another beam joined mine from further down the slope, accompanied by a familiar voice yelling my name. Reinforcements, finally. The creature, caught between our flashlights, whirled in a frenzy of snapping claws and gnashing teeth. Its skin began to smoke where the light touched it, a sickening smell filling the air. And then, with a final howl of rage, it turned and vanished into the undergrowth, the sounds of its retreat muffled by the pounding rain and the roaring pulse in my ears. My fellow rangers, Edie and Walker, found me slumped against a tree, bleeding and gasping for breath. Their faces were a mix of relief and horror when they saw the claw marks raking my shoulder. Edie patched me up as best she could, while Walker swept the area, found my rifle further down the ravine, but no sign of the creature. It took two of them to haul me back down the trail to the main road. They kept throwing nervous glances over their shoulders, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Every rustle of branches, every echoing hoot of an owl made us jumpy. It wasn't until the flashing lights of the ambulance came into view that I began to relax the death grip I had on my pistol. At the hospital, they stitched me up, ran every test imaginable, and then came the questions.
Park Service? Local cops?
They all wanted details. I stumbled through a description of the creature, doing my best to stick to the facts, avoid sounding like a lunatic seeing monsters. They exchanged uneasy looks. I could read it in their eyes. They didn't fully believe me. Word must have leaked because soon enough the reporters descended. Questions about the missing hiker, the animal attack. I stuck to my line. Injuries attributed to falling during the rescue mission. Can't have the whole world thinking there's some unholy beast roaming our national parks. They bought the story, at least officially. The aftermath was a blur. Weeks of physical therapy for my torn-up shoulder. Nightmares that jolted me awake, sweating and gasping. I went back to work eventually, but everything had changed. Every hike, every patrol, I scanned the trees, not for lost hikers, but for those glowing yellow eyes and the stench of decay. And there were rumors, whispers among the other rangers. A sighting of a strange, emaciated figure near a campsite. A string of shredded tents blamed on wild animal activity. Or that whisper about the lone hiker who went missing deep in the backcountry, leaving behind only a single monstrous footprint in the mud. Nobody ever connected the dots officially, of course. One night I was on a late patrol when I encountered Edie at a crossroads deep in the park. She didn't say a word, just passed me a thermos of strong coffee and a sealed envelope. Didn't need to ask what was inside. Silver bullets, hand-loaded. Not standard issue for park rangers, that's for sure. She met my gaze, the unspoken understanding clear in her eyes. After what you saw, she said, her voice low. Figured you could use these. Be careful out here, Elias. The knowledge that I wasn't alone in this, that helped, some nights at least. But there was also a growing certainty. This wasn't over. That creature was still out there. Call it a Wendigo, a demon, whatever those old stories named it. The fact remains, there's something preying on the lost and alone in these mountains. One day maybe I'd track it down, put an end to its reign of terror. but that felt like a fool's hope. See, the thing about fighting monsters is, they fight back. And sometimes they win. One foggy morning, a shredded backpack turns up, or a hiker vanishes on a familiar trail, and I'm left wondering if it got another one. Meanwhile, my own life's on hold. Got a half-healed scar, a beat-up old truck, and a growing collection of high-powered flashlights. No wife, no kids. Can't drag anyone into this mess. Sometimes I think about leaving the mountains, try getting lost in a big city crowd for a while, see if I could just disappear. But then I remember the faces of the missing. The way that young hikers' torn-up gear was strewn across the trail. The look in Edie's eyes when she handed me those bullets. And something stubborn and stupid inside me digs in. So I stay, keep my gear ready, rifle cleaned, and an extra flashlight within reach at all times. Every time I drive along the park roads, every time I head into the woods, the weight of responsibility settles heavy on my shoulders. Feels less like a job now, and more like a war. A war most folks don't even know is happening. And out there, under the old trees and shrouded in the mountain fog, it waits. The creature with the glowing eyes and the unending hunger waits for the next lost hiker, the next overconfident camper, the next ranger who stumbles upon its shadowed domain. Some nights lying awake in my cabin with the rain rattling the roof and the wind sounding like a mournful howl, I wonder who it will be waiting for when I inevitably fail. When my flashlight flickers or my aim misjudges or it finally catches me unaware. And who, if anyone, will take up the fight when I'm gone. Maybe someday this story will get told after it's too late for me. Maybe some younger ranger, green and brave and foolish like I used to be, will find this account. If that's you, whoever you are, well, good luck, kid. You'll need it. Because trust me, the monsters are real. The battle will never end. And if the shadows in the woods seem a little deeper, those glowing eyes in the distance a little brighter, the rustle of leaves a little closer, best keep your wits sharp and your flashlight ready. You might just be the next line of defense against the things unseen. As I, James Walker, sit here in my Seattle apartment looking out at the city lights that never quite banish the darkness, I can't help but feel a connection to Elias and all the others who face the unknown in the wilderness. Our stories may differ in the details, but the core truth remains the same. There are things out there, things beyond our understanding, and they're hungry. I've often wondered if I should have stayed, should have fought like Elias did. But fear got the better of me. I ran from the forests, from the responsibility. Yet even here, surrounded by concrete and steel, I can't escape the memory of those eyes, that unholy scree. I've often wondered if I should have stayed, should have fought like Elias did. But fear got the better of me. I ran from the forests, from the responsibility. Yet even here, surrounded by concrete and steel, I can't escape the memory of those eyes, that unholy screech. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I find myself reaching for a flashlight, peering out into the city shadows. Because deep down, I know the truth that Elias and others like him face every day. The monsters are real, and they're not confined to the wilderness. They're out there waiting, watching, and whether we choose to face them or not, their hunger never ceases. So to anyone who reads this, remember, stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and always keep a light nearby. The battle against the unseen may never end, but as long as there are those willing to stand against the darkness, there's hope.